Order, order. Tony Vaughan to move the motion.
Mr. Stringer, it is always a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I beg to move that this House has considered whether social media should be banned for children under the age of 16. Mr. Stringer, I'd like to start by thanking Kim Campbell, who is the petitioner and is sitting in the public gallery, for submitting this petition, which has gained over 130,000 signatures. Kim believes that the answer to the question posed is yes. Now, Mr. Stringer, when I asked my two boys, who are aged 14 and 10, whether social media should be banned for children, their answer was a predictable no, of course. But when you ask the same question of UK adults, the overwhelming majority respond yes. 75% of them, in fact, according to a poll published last month, based on a survey of 2,000 adults, I think. On the same theme, I asked my constituents in Folkestone and Hyde last week whether smartphones should be banned in schools, and almost 2,000 responded. And again, 75% thought that they should. And I should say that many of the 24% who thought that they shouldn't looked to me like many of them were still at school themselves. Are adults imagining that there is a problem here? Do we just not understand our young people? I've heard it said more than once that most adults don't see how important social media is to young people's social and digital identity, that we can't teach boundaries unless if you ban access to these apps altogether. Now, I totally agree that social media can be a space where young people can build positive relationships with their peers, reduce loneliness, improve coping skills, and improve general knowledge and creativity. Social media can, of course, be a wonderful tool, but it's currently a wild west where there is too much harmful content. Yes.
Thank you very much for giving way and for the intervention. Would you agree with me that, given where we are with social media today, that legislation has just not kept up with the pace of change, and actually we are so far behind when it comes to being able to tackle with this issue, given how far social media usage is, and yet the pace of change in terms of our legislation has just not met that demand?
The honourable friend raises an interesting point. I mean, the legislative regime we have at the moment, as I'll come on to say, will require risk assessments. Now, the state of the evidence, as it was when the Online Safety Act was being passed, is different to the evidence that we now have today. And so the nature of those assessments, the nature of the risks, necessarily is different. And as I'll come on to say, we need to look at that on a continual basis. But as I say, social media can be a wonderful tool, but it's become a wild west where there's too much harmful content being pushed onto young people, and social media companies are simply not doing enough to tackle it. The sad fact of the matter is that social media is pushing content that radicalises, catalyses mental health crises, and is highly addictive. The head of MI5, Ken McCallum, last month raised alarm about how extremist ideologies are reaching children as young as 12 through social media platforms, and young people radicalised by social media are on their books. This, of course, is a growing threat to national security. Mental health crises. We're seeing skyrocketing rates of anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and even suicide among adolescents.
My honourable friend, give way.
Yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate him on an excellent speech. Does he agree with me that on that point on mental health and well-being, students locally from Brighton Hill School in my constituency recently raised the significant impact that social media was having on their mental health and well-being? And does he agree with me that actually it's not just adults that are concerned, it is young people, and that they should be involved in this review of legislation because it is them that is having where it's having the most detrimental impact on their health and well-being?
I completely agree with my honourable friend and congratulate his constituents, the children in his constituency, for taking a very sensible approach. And of course, even we're seeing that, and I think it's interesting that children themselves are coming forward and saying this, because they are perhaps seeing the harms that I'm talking about and want to do something about it. We've seen cases where children as young as 14 have taken their own lives after being bullied or exposed to harmful online content. During the preparation for this debate, I was informed by the NSPCC that there is an online website posing as a community that encourages suicide. This is the dark and depressing side of the online world that we have to do more to tackle. And what about addiction? Social media platforms are designed to exploit vulnerabilities in our young people. Algorithms push harmful content, be it body image issues or self-harm videos or anxiety videos directly onto their feeds. And a recent survey showed that on TikTok, the algorithm was 4,343% more likely to show toxic eating disorder content to users who were already vulnerable to such issues. Many of you will have seen the Channel 4 documentary Swiped, where a secondary school took the phones of Year 8 pupils for 12 weeks to see what happened, and the results were impressive. Children talked to their friends more, reported less anxiety, and were more focused in class. Yes.
I wonder if my honourable friend would agree with me that given that 70% of youth services and investment has been slashed since 2010, that actually we need to make sure that we're actually providing opportunities aside from school where children actually can interact before taking away one of the few places they actually do have to spend time with their peers now.
My honourable friend raises a really important point. This can't be about shutting down avenues for young people to socialise with each other. And so whatever action is taken to make it harder for young people to access social media, we have to make sure that other things are going on in society so they don't feel this is the only place they can go to socialise. The petitioner's view, as I said, is that we should ban access to social media until children are 16. When I spoke to the NSPCC before this debate, their position is that they do not think an outright ban is the answer. Without changing the software or the devices, a ban on children using social media without more would be unenforceable. The NSPCC's view is that a ban would push children into unregulated and more dangerous online spaces. But what about the Online Safety Act? Does that do enough? Several people I spoke to in preparing for this debate think that it does. Like requirements for social media companies to conduct children's access assessments to determine whether children are likely to access their platform. And like online age assurance measures, which require social media companies to assess whether their services are likely to be accessed by children and adopt robust methods such as photo ID matching, facial age estimation and mobile network checks. Of course, these age assurance measures are right, but groups such as Smartphone-Free Childhood do not believe that risk assessment and the Online Safety Act more broadly go far enough. They advocate for an approach not of risk assessment and risk reduction methods. They say that the onus should be on the social media companies to demonstrate that their apps are safe for children to use, and if they can't, then their app cannot be used by children. And this seems to be the opposite of the onus being on the regulator to prove that an app is dangerous or harmful. Now, it may well be that this would be something the Code of Practice under the Online Safety Act could do. It would require tightening the Code of Practice, and it would be useful to know from the Minister whether he agrees that the Act would be capable of reversing that burden, as well as whether we ought to perhaps think about those methods. Yes.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Does he agree with me that legislation can go so far, but actually there is a broader responsibility for all of us as adults in society, and for many of us, myself included, as parents, to make sure not only that we're monitoring what our children are using and how they're using it, but also our own habits too. And I think specifically of a head teacher in my constituency of Mid-Sussex who was alarmed that she'd had to write to her parents telling them that when they're collecting their infants from the playground to put their phones away, have eye contact with their children, engage with their children.
Thank the honourable member for her intervention. She raises a common sense point. If we are going to advocate for change, we have to lead by example. But it might be said that the harms that we're talking about are somewhat a separate issue to that. Of course, we need to take responsibility, but where we have social media companies who are pushing content which is objectively dangerous, we need to have the conversation that we are having today about how the system and how social media companies should be forced to make sure that that space is a safe one. Now, yes.
I thank the Honourable Friend for giving way, and for the parents who brought this petition. As ever, it feels like they're often way ahead of us as legislators when it comes to issues affecting children's safety. My Honourable Friend is doing a very good job, I think, of setting out some of the possible risks that the Online Safety Act won't fully be able to mitigate some of the challenges we're seeing today. And the robust measures around consideration about the age of access to social media is, I think, a timely and important one about how we can think through the best way of protecting young people from possible exposure to online harm. On top of that, though, recognising that some exposure is always likely to be there, it's important too, would you agree, to make sure that we're thinking about how through the curriculum review we can best empower children, young people and their parents to be best set up to protect themselves from harm where they are exposed to it, even with the stronger regulations we're looking to put in place.
I completely agree with my honourable friend. This has to be, we're not going to protect children just by government or just through social media and expecting parents to do nothing. Of course, parents are going to have to do our part. But interestingly on this point, I was going to say that an important measure, potential measure, is the approach put forward by my honourable friend, the member for Whitehaven and Workington, in his private member's bill, the Safer Phones Bill. And his concept, which I hope to hear more about in the course of this debate, is about raising the age of data consent from 13 to 16. So you essentially stop the social media companies being able to harvest data and keep feeding the kind of content that is going to be harmful, which seems to me to be a no-brainer. But very briefly, I want to talk about smartphones in schools, because that is a closely connected issue to the one that is posed by the petitioner. Many teachers and parents I've talked to have believed that this never seen, never heard guidance from the government, introduced under the previous government, I should say, isn't working, where we have students still using phones during break time and often during lessons, and the problems that that causes are significant. And I've had so many teachers say to me, this takes up so much time, it's a huge distraction, and it interferes with learning. Yes.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Prior to entering Parliament, I worked for JDRF, the Type 1 Diabetes charity, and one of the issues that came to light when this was previously proposed by the government was the fact that children who might need to use their phones to monitor their Type 1 diabetes or have carers' responsibilities need to have an exemption. This creates a stigma between children who might have a medical requirement to use a mobile device and those who don't. And how would you see this interact with that?
Well, I think every school has to comply with the Equality Act, and so whatever policy a school puts in place, then one would have to check that what they're doing is in compliance with the law. And so those sort of exception situations would obviously have to be looked at very, very carefully. But what I was going to say is that we don't have to look far to see examples of local areas that have banned smartphones in schools, like in the London Borough of Barnet. Yes.
I thank my honourable friend for raising the action that's taken place in the London Borough of Barnet, where I have the honour of being one of the 3 members of Parliament. I've been working closely with local teachers in primary schools and in secondary schools, and the fantastic smartphone-free campaign in North London, led by a wonderful volunteer called Nova. And we now have 103 primary schools in the borough committing to going smartphone-free from September, and every secondary school too, saying that they will start from year 7 and upwards, some going further and faster, to go smartphone-free in secondaries. And that's not just not seen and not heard, but it's actually head teachers working together, so they have safety in numbers, backed up by their MPs, to say that unless there are specific exemptions that apply, smartphones will not even be allowed on the premises. And to your earlier point, if I may, what's also been really encouraging is that some teachers are going further and saying that parents shouldn't be allowed to use smartphones on the grounds too, for those reasons that you were pointing out. But thank you for raising Barnet. It's been fantastic to work with the campaign locally and to support parents and young children in my constituency.
His activism, his organising on this issue, and I know he's played a big role in the outcomes that he has just described. And an example more local to my constituency of Folkestone and Hythe, there's a policy designed by the John Wallace Academy in Ashford in Kent, where students put their mobile phones in a locked pouch during the day, and the principal, Mr McBeath, had intended that the rule would limit disruption in school and support safeguarding. I, for one, am going to be advocating for this whenever I speak to heads in Folkestone and Hythe. The work being done by Smartphone Free Childhood nationally and their group in Folkestone and Hythe, I commend, and I think it's really important to work closely with everyone involved to try to address the problems that social media use is creating for our young people. So I am conscious of all the other people that want to speak today, as well as the Minister. But I have a couple of questions for the Minister when we ultimately get to them, which are essentially, and I've raised one of them already, but whether the Minister believes that the Code of Practice is likely to be robust enough in the coming years as we see more evidence of the harms caused by social media and what changes may be needed as time goes by. And also whether he thinks Ofcom is striking the right balance between safeguarding children from harm and ensuring economic proportionality. And if there's anything that Ofcom is doing or can do to tackle the small but high-risk online sites that act as online communities that encourage things like suicide that I referred to earlier. And what measures can the government, lastly, measures the government can take to get ahead of AI development to ensure that children can be effectively protected from the risk posed by AI so that our politics can forge once again with technical progress. But anyway, it's enough from me, and I look forward to hearing others' contributions.
Thank you. Can I remind members that even if they've put in to speak, they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. The debate is well subscribed, and when we start, I'm going to ask honourable members to stick to about 6 minutes. I won't put a time limit on now, but that should enable people everybody who's put in to speak. And finally, Mr. Speaker has made it clear that if people are called to speak, they should be here for the wind-ups, as in the chamber. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 700086 relating to a minimum age for social media. Rebecca Paul.
To support this petition calling for social media companies to be banned from allowing children under the age of 16 to create social media accounts. I stand here today in complete agreement with the over 700 Reigate constituents who signed urging us to take action on this important issue. As a mother of 3 myself, I spend much time worrying about the impact of social media and screen time on my children and their peers. When I was growing up, in the school holidays, I was out playing with my friends, climbing trees, building camps and learning those critical social skills that we all need in adulthood. Instead now, we don't let our children out, and the only world we allow them to explore is a fantasy one that is rife with risk and doesn't equip them with the life skills they need. When they are online, they can interact with predatory individuals without realising. They can see unrealistic body images that batter their self-esteem, and they can be convinced that black is white through false information. This is extremely damaging. Many adults fall for these things too, so how on earth do we expect our children not to? It is also no coincidence that we see a mental health crisis in our young people at the same time as mass adoption of smartphones and access to social media. Yes, increased mental health support is needed, but the best remedy is to just remove the root cause. I would note that the previous Conservative government has taken some welcome first steps in the fight to safeguard our children through the introduction of the Online Safety Act. Thanks to this Act, providers must be proactive in removing illegal content like child sexual abuse material, but also must protect children and young people from content that is harmful. This could include harassment, abuse or bullying, and content on suicide, self-harm and eating disorders. The Act also includes welcome measures to prevent children from accessing online pornography, something I particularly welcome in light of the huge damage this material does to both our girls and boys. While the Online Safety Act is a welcome starting point, we must go further. This is also overwhelmingly the view of Brits, 75% of whom now back raising the minimum age from 13 to 16, as per a recent More in Common survey. If we do raise the minimum age to 16, and I hope that we do, more thought needs to be given to the question of enforcement. While platforms may set a minimum age requirement, 13 being the standard for most social media sites, these limits are easy to circumvent. If teenagers can't evade the ban by using a simple VPN, then we won't get the full benefits of an increase to the age limit. It would be of great value to hear more today on the best ways to overcome this particular challenge. I also want to touch quickly on smartphones, as this is another route to better safeguarding and protecting our children, and some really powerful points have already been made by the Honourable Member. I strongly support a ban on smartphones in schools for children up to the age of 16. On a typical weekday, 42% of older teenagers say their smartphone is distracting them from schoolwork, and nearly half say social media has distracted them enough to impact their grades. Notably, only 11% of schools are genuinely smartphone-free currently, and children at these schools get GCSE results 1 to 2 grades higher. So there is clearly much upside in banning smartphones in schools. The Conservatives recently tabled an amendment to Labour's Children's Wellbeing and Education Bill to do exactly that, but unfortunately it was voted down. I would urge the Labour government to seriously consider implementing this much-needed restriction in some shape or form. To be honest, I'm perplexed as to why they rejected it from their bill, when this one thing would be a game-changer in terms of protecting children and improving educational outcomes, the whole purpose of the bill. So I do hope they will reconsider this amendment at a later stage. I will, of course, give way.
Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful that actually one of my constituents is here today who's campaigned hard on a smartphone ban, but does she recognise that whilst we can ban phones in schools, and the majority of schools have banned phones, it actually won't stop kids bringing phones to school, playing with them when they get outside the school gates, and actually it's a much bigger challenge than just banning phones when they're within that school boundary.
I thank the Honourable Member for making that point, and I think it is tricky. I'm not saying that it isn't a difficult thing to achieve, but I think if we have a ban, it makes it a little easier for schools. So we have obviously implemented guidance. I think we can see that's not cut through as much as we would like, so we now need to accept that we need to go further and introduce a ban in order that schools have it's much easier for them to take action when it's on a statutory footing. I also just want to mention the Honourable Member for Whitehaven and Workington, who has been doing great work on safer phones for our children, which I want to recognise and thank him for. And I hope to be able to support his private member's bill on the 7th of March. These are exactly the type of initiatives that we should be working together on a cross-party basis, because I think we all agree that we want to protect our children. In closing, I would encourage ministers and the government as a whole to engage fully with the excellent points that have already been made and I'm sure will be made during this debate, and act swiftly to protect our children from an increasingly insidious online realm that they are simply not equipped to navigate. I hope the Minister will give serious consideration to raising the minimum age for social media to 16 and banning smartphones in schools. The value from these two changes alone would be huge for our society, and we would all thank you for it. Thank you.
Lola McAvoy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And thank you to my honourable friend and petitioner for bringing this vital debate. Since my election in July, I have spoken several times, including in this chamber, about children's safety online. For too long, our children's development, protection from harm from predators, inappropriate and disturbing content, and from each other has been left as an afterthought. As legislators, it falls to us to protect our children, but we are way behind where we need to be. In my constituency of Darlington, this issue came up time and time again on the campaign trail, as parents, siblings, grandparents all reported feeling ill-equipped to fulfil their most important role to allow their children a safe and healthy childhood. It is vital we understand that parents are asking for our support now because, for many of them, the fight and pressure from their own children to allow them the latest phone, more screen time, access to an adult version of a game, and much more feels relentless. This debate today is about social media, but it's also about the digital age of consent, as has already been highlighted. My view is this: children under 16 should not be given the responsibility to permit or deny companies their data. The risks are too high, and the long-awaited children's codes from Ofcom are not yet in place, so we haven't seen how the measures from the Online Safety Act will actually impact children's behaviour and experience online, so we should stipulate the age of digital consent as 16. Last week, I visited Firth Moor Primary School in Darlington for an assembly on online safety. It was exceptional. The children had songs and raps and role play and helpful tips for staying safe online. These children are online already, and they're aged 4 to 11. One thing that struck me was the children's understanding of passive screen time versus active screen time. And passive screen time is includes scrolling aimlessly through suggested content, and active screen time is about learning. So these children are trying to protect themselves, but it can't just be left to them. I do not think that we can ban children from accessing screens, but what we must do is safeguard them from harm until they're old enough to navigate the risks themselves. I will.
Thank you very much for giving way. My wife and I regret ever getting a smartphone for our two eldest children. We've got 4. We're wondering what to do when the third expects access to the same rights, and it's something we continually get wrong as to the management of that. My honourable friend has talked about screen time. It cannot be that beyond the wit of the creators of our smartphones to give parental controls more intuitive use, better intuitive use, that they can't be undermined so easily by the smart children using the smartphones. Would she agree that as well as strengthening the role of Ofcom here in rooting out the toxic content that our children are pushed towards, that actually the job of the smartphone manufacturers need to empower parents, because it is a real concern, it's a daily battle for parents with their children of their use of smartphone and their access to social media?
I actually do really fully support what he's saying there, because lots of parents in Darlington have said to me that whilst the default setting may be off for children to access chat rooms on games or the next more violent version of a game, because it's not just about the phones and the devices, it's what they're accessing on those devices that really matters, and they just lose the battle. So when it comes to the crunch and their child's arguing that they want to go on it and they're going to have a tantrum, they just allow them to go on it, and they do need more support from us as legislators, which is basically my point. Yeah, children should be able to enjoy games and access safe and engaging educational content. These platforms should not be allowed to target them with suggested content. That's where the problems are coming in. So when there's suggested content going in, we're seeing children being exposed to things that are harmful and also unhealthy. They should have children-safe search engines, and features like live location and chat rooms should be designed to be transparent, child-friendly, and with their safety at their heart. To access features like chatting with strangers, adults that they don't know, or sharing content should be solely for those who've been strictly age-verified as over 16. These are all features of social media. For me, I will.
I thank her for giving way and for the work that she's done with my constituent Ellen Room on issues to do with children and social media. As a Liberal, I'm instinctively against banning things. However, Liberal society has long tolerated lower age limits or minimum age limits for things like cigarettes and alcohol and other things. Driving, for example, things that might be dangerous to children. I wonder whether she agrees with me that we should consider social media along those grounds.
I think that's absolutely right, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his intervention there. I think it's really important that we strike the right balance. So for a long time we've been behind on protecting children online. It's time now to use the Online Safety Act and the upcoming children's codes to get it right first time, because we don't know how they're going to bed in, and it's really crucial that in the first iterances of the children's codes coming out in April that we get it absolutely right. So for me, to access these features and chat with strangers or have content suggested to you, you need to have been strictly age verified as over 16. For me, the online world is a hugely valuable part of modern life, and like everything we do offline, we must ensure that it's safe and regulated for children to use. If it's not, we don't let them use it. In Darlington, I've set up an online safety forum with my year 10s across every secondary school in the town. The biggest concern from them is the disturbing content which the Online Safety Act and Children's Codes should protect against. But they've also flagged to me awful, horrible examples of peer-to-peer bullying, which is totally acceptable on social media platforms and goes unchecked. Ofcom are required to issue new codes every 3 years. So if the first codes don't get it right in April, we could be waiting for 3 years for a 13-year-old to be protected properly, by which point they will be 16 anyway. The age for social media in its current form, where platforms are able to suggest content and children can chat unchecked with strangers should clearly be 16. Those without age verification should only be able to access child-safe, limited platforms that are designed for children. It just makes common sense to me. I am concerned that without further legislation on this, platforms will be left to implement their own safeguards, which in some cases may well be good. But it is our job not to leave the protection of children online to chance. We should stipulate an age, we should require ID, and we should be bold leaders in this space. Our children will look back and ask us what we were waiting for.
Damien Hines.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to Kim Campbell and the petitioners for bringing this debate, including almost 400 people who've signed from East Hampshire. There's been a lot of interest of late in Australia and their upcoming ban on social media for over 16s. I was interested in how they're going to do that, considering some of the complexities and definitional difficulties. There's a very good interview with Australia's E-Safety Commissioner on American National Public Radio, which I recommend to colleagues, in which she says that it's not about flicking some big switch. And there was a possibility that some social media functionality could be removed rather than an entire app being blocked off, that messages in gaming sites and anything that delivers education or healthcare information would be exempt, and that ultimately it will be for the Minister of Communication to decide which platforms are in and which are out. Well, I hope they have reinvested in their legal defence budgets. It is true that parents have quite a wide variety of what they think is good or acceptable. Everybody agrees that the child should be able to call home or text home to let mum or dad know that they're delayed or they're feeling worried or the club's been cancelled or whatever. But some also value some things that you can only do on a smartphone, like being able to use the map then to find your way home. And then there's, of course, a whole other debate about education technology and the use of Show My Homework and all the rest of it. Some parents, of course, are totally happy with the entirety of the electronic world, smartphones and social media. And often, let's be honest, it is parents who help the children get round the minimum age limit to be on some of these platforms. And of course, sometimes we say, well, they only do that because of the fear of the child missing out. And that may be true in many, many cases, but candidly, we don't know that that's true in the majority of cases. So in addressing these questions, we quite often as legislators fall back on being able to say, well, hang on, we're not talking about banning all phones, we're talking about specifically smartphones. And we're not talking about getting rid of the good stuff, we're only talking about getting rid of the bad stuff. This, of course, is the easy stage in the legislative process. It becomes much harder later when we have to precisely define what we mean. And I am about to recommit that sin. I am going to talk about an ill-defined it that we may in some way want to restrict. And it is something about smartphones and something about social media, which I will today fail to define. But then at the end, I hope to come back and say a little bit about more precisely what we mean. Now, it's been said by others, I'm not in the business of trying to put new restrictions on parents to how they should manage their families and do things, or try and do things too that they could do for themselves. But there is already a minimum age for social media. It just happens to be an arbitrary age that is set based on some legislation, not even from this country, from the 1990s. And when GDPR came in through the European Union, as we were in then, you could choose an age, anywhere between 13 and 16, and different countries chose different ages. We happen to have settled on 13. And most people would say that you do have to set the bar somewhere. So the question becomes where. You could, of course, alternatively say that the government or a regulator have no role in setting an age at all. But if that is not your view, then you have to ask the secondary question, which is if you accept there should be an age, what should that age be? And there is no ancient right to be on TikTok at age 13. These are novel technologies, and they are questions we are facing now for the first time. There are in this country two main thresholds for the transition from childhood to adulthood. They're at 16 and 18. They're not the only ones, but they are the main ones. There has never been in English law a concept of an age of digital consent, nor was there previously, to my knowledge, a non-digital concept of consent for somebody under the age of majority in contract law. And it seems to me, I grant you it is arguable, but it seems to me that 16 is the most appropriate threshold. I will, of course.
Thank you very much for giving way. I've met with smartphone-free childhood parents, but also with young people. It's a big issue in Brighton Pavilion. And I wanted to just check if you've thought about pushing, as other members have done, for the Minister and for members to talk more with young people about where this age limit should lie, rather than trying to come up with a number in the middle of a debate. It's clear from talking to young people, they do feel that parts of social media are very toxic, but I also think they're best placed to judge where the limit should lie.
To be fair to this minister and to previous ministers, I think ministers do make efforts to hear from young people. There's a very good, very interesting survey done by the Youth Endowment Fund, which I commend to her and to others, which asks 13 to 17-year-olds, I think it is, quite an extreme proposition. If you could turn off social media forever for you and everybody else, would you do it? And it's not a majority say yes, but something like a third of teenagers say yes to that extreme proposition. And then, of course, there are various other surveys that we have, but it's certainly true that when you talk to children, I'm sure many colleagues here have in schools across their constituency, you do get a variety of views. In particular, children don't want to be left out. If everybody else is on something, and parents, you know, as parents, we don't want that for our children either. If everybody else is in a certain group or has a certain means of communication, we tend to want our children to have that too. The evidence is not perfect, and there is some evidence that some screen time is a positive good. The PISA 2019 study talks about the Goldilocks effect, where about an hour of screen time was beneficial for mental well-being, then after that it declined. But that same study found wide differences in life satisfaction between what they call extreme internet users and others. And there are plenty of other studies by now on everything from happiness, quality of relationship, eyesight, effect on sleep and on concentration. And then, of course, there's the rising incidence of mental ill health among teenagers, which, for the avoidance of doubt and to take politics out of it, is not unique to this country and is not uniquely a post-COVID effect either. Causality is still hard to prove, but it does seem to me extraordinary that when we're talking about children, we allow something to happen because we cannot 100% prove that it causes harm, rather than only saying that we should allow it to happen if we can prove it is safe. It is not the way we deal with food for children or toys for children, for example. And I would turn the question around. If you talk about something like the prevalence of self-harm, are people really trying to suggest that this isn't something to do with the prevalence and normalisation of that imagery on social media? Now, the Online Safety Act was a landmark piece of legislation. We'll debate it again here in Westminster Hall on Wednesday. But I think everybody that worked on that bill, which includes myself, everyone was always clear it would not be the last time we had to come back to this subject in legislation. And I think it is inevitable that there is going to be further regulation, there will be further restrictions in the interests of greater child protection. And so I would urge the government to move from working out whether there will be to what those things will be. Of course, to write legislation, to come back to where I started, you need to be able to define things precisely. In reality, there is no bright line between a smartphone and a brick phone. There is no slam dunk definition of social media either. And it can be instructive to think about individual platforms, individual services. What are the things we worry about? TikTok, do we worry about TikTok? Yes, I think we probably worry about TikTok. Do we worry about Snapchat? Yes, we probably do, because of the association with bullying and the disappearing messages. But some families also quite like the Snap Friends function of being able to see where the different members are. Instagram, do we worry about that? Yes, we probably do, and has a particular association with issues around body image. But also it's a way that people share lovely family photos, and it's a way for extended families to keep in touch. WhatsApp. So a lot of families allow children to have WhatsApp, and they wouldn't allow them to have, say, TikTok. And up until quite recently, we probably wouldn't even have called it a social media, or some wouldn't even have called it a social media platform. But if you look at what happens in some other countries, where we think we've got problems with, say, TikTok or Facebook, with disinformation, in other countries it is with WhatsApp. And what about YouTube? So for many people, YouTube isn't social media. It's just a place you go and watch videos, or it's a place you go for music. But because it has user-generated content, it is also social media. And it certainly is capable of sucking up a lot of young people's time, and it certainly has some of those potential rabbit holes that people can fall down. What about gaming? Gaming is different from social media, but modern gaming also has quite a lot of social media-like functions, like lists of friends, and certainly it's a way of trying to create communities of common interest. It's also often linked to the use of Discord or streaming on Twitch. And again, it certainly takes up a lot of time, unless, of course, you're in China, where the government will only allow you to do it for 1 hour a day on a Friday, a Saturday, and a Sunday. Now, all of the above, they all have risks attached, they all have negatives. But I don't think we are likely to say we want to ban all of those things, far from it. There's also a different risk that, of course, if you take one thing and ban it based on its specific features, its specific definition, you just push people to other places. And other things will get more kind of social media kind of characteristics, and children may end up in darker places on the internet. All of which is probably why the Australians ended up where they did, in terms of saying that it's probably more about specific functionality, and it might be about, at the end, having to make a case-by-case judgment. We worry about content, we worry about unwanted, inappropriate contact, as others have said. And we also worry about excessive amounts of time that children spend on these platforms, the potentially addictive nature, the effect on sleep, on concentration, and myopia, and crucially, and my honourable friend, I thought, covered this very well, how these technologies can crowd out other things. So whether they in and of themselves are good or bad, there's only 24 hours in a day. And for the time that you're not at school and not asleep as a child, we want them to be able to access the full range of things that childhood should be all about. I'm going on way too long. Mr. Stringer.
There's no defined limit at the moment, but I did suggest people took about 6 minutes, so I presume the right honourable gentleman is bringing his remarks to a conclusion.
I confessed myself a sinner at the start, Mr. Stringer, but I will now come to a close. We've covered a lot in the Online Safety Act with content and contact. We need to do more, I think, on this question of time and addiction. I'm pleased to see some of that in the honourable gentleman's work. In the meantime, we do need to do more, as others have said, on parental controls. I would like to see NHS advice to parents, which can be very, very powerful, on what's an appropriate amount of time for children. And we need to enforce the existing thresholds, the existing age limits, particularly that one at age 13, and recognising that some people who did prove themselves falsely to be age 13 when they were 8 or 9 or 10 are now showing up on social media lists as being over 18, when in fact they're still in their much earlier teens.
Yes, McAllister.
Thank you. Thanks. Sorry, I'm turning it off there. Thank you, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. The debate so far has done a really good job of summarising lots of the reasons why I chose earlier last year to bring forward a private member's bill to address some of these issues around addictive features of smartphones and social media, to do with the impacts on sleep, mental health, educational attainment, and increasingly evidence about the concerns related to conspiracy theories and their ability to spread, particularly amongst young children. What I want to focus my remarks on today are specifically about the evidence, because I think it's in the evidence where the political debate is moving to. That's where there seems to be the greatest disagreement about whether we've got enough evidence now to act with confidence, or whether we should pause and wait for further evidence to be established. And so I want to spend a few moments focusing my remarks on that. And there's three ways that I think about this. The first is that globally, in 2012, something happened. Not just here, but around the Western world, and in fact beyond the Western world. Specifically to do with teenage mental health, and specifically to do with levels of anxiety and depression amongst our young people. Now, that global event coincided with the rise in access to smartphones and the access to social media and high-speed internet. There is no other plausible hypothesis I have heard come across, and I welcome interventions from colleagues here today, to explain that global phenomenon. There is no coherent alternative hypothesis. And so when we think about the evidence that we require to act in this country, we should think really carefully about whether or not we are looking at actually developed different hypotheses for why this problem has grown. The second, this links to another member's point, is the precautionary principle. The tech industry in particular is very effective at casting doubt over findings from studies that have been produced. And so what has happened over the years is the burden of proof, the burden of evidence on those, like many of us here today and the petitioners who brought this forward, the burden of proof falls to them to establish beyond reasonable doubt that there is a link, a causal link between the use of smartphones and social media and the harms that it may cause. But I think that it's important in this debate and in others to balance where that evidence should be brought from. So surely we should have a burden of proof on those rolling out, technology platforms that are gobbling up huge amounts of children and young people's time. These are fairly conservative estimates, but the average 12-year-old is spending the equivalent of a part-time job every week on their smartphone. Now, surely that must have had some effect on how they might have used their time before that had happened, and the development of their brains and their relationships with other people whilst they're on those platforms. Surely, yeah.
Thank you to my honourable friend for giving way and for his private member's bill, which I wholeheartedly support. On the evidence, would he also agree that there's now increasingly pilots? Obviously, one was referenced in the Swipe documentary, but the All Saints Catholic College of my school, where I had 70 parents 2 weeks ago meet to discuss this topic, have seen in their own evidence base in the school the impact of a much stricter smartphone policy. So we're starting to see both the evidence of the harms, as you've talked about, but also some interesting pilots that show what the improvements could be if we take on measures like the internet age of consent and a stronger policy on schools.
Yeah, and I thank my honourable friend for his work on this issue in his constituency as well. And he's absolutely right, both with micro-experiments, but also with the anecdotal feedback that, that we've had from members of the public, many of whom have signed this petition in large numbers, show that parents are really worried that something is going on here, that the evidence will take some time to gather. So the second aspect there is about where the burden of proof should lie, and applying the burden of proof in one direction only to those advocating tighter regulation is not balanced. It should apply both ways. And the third point about evidence is to do with the absence of causal studies that we have at the moment that will take many years to acquire, and what we do in the absence of those causal studies with the weight of correlational evidence that sits before us. And this is where I think we must look at the work of Sir Austin Bradford Hill. Now, the Bradford Hill criteria, which were named after him in the 1960s, were based on the epidemiologist's work to try to fill in the evidence gap for policymakers when the debate was being had about the public health impacts of smoking. The tobacco industry did a very effective job of casting doubt over whether or not it was smoking itself that caused cancer, or whether, as the industry then said, smoking simply brought cancer out earlier, that it was something that was inherent within people. That was the argument. And they said there was no correlational study to prove that that was not the case, which goes back to my burden of proof argument. Now, in trying to fill in the gap, because we will not have causal studies for many, many years, and so petitions like this will continue to come, this debate will carry on raging, and politicians will be pulled towards this problem until we find a way of solving it. In the absence of those correlational studies, we have to find a way of applying a framework to look at the existing causal studies that sit before us. And the Bradford Hill criteria, when you look at the factors, it's 9 factors, I won't go through all of them, but for example, dose response rate. So does the amount of time or the amount of dose of a certain factor relate to the degree of the impact? UK Millennium Cohort Study 2019. Social media use is associated with mental health in young people. The greater use means greater impact. 2022 dose response meta-analysis. More time spent on social media was significantly associated with depression. There are stacks of these studies out there that show the correlation between time spent and impact. And when you work through those 9 criteria, in the absence of a causal study or series of causal studies, I think the evidence points in the very clear direction that we need tighter regulation that can empower parents to set the boundaries, the collective rules for how our children use smartphones and social media. And the final thing to say is that there is at times a risk that this debate gets characterised into pro or anti-tech. And my final reflection really is that for the UK to be the global sandbox of great tech development, which it should be, we need really good, intuitive, shared rules that can garner high degrees of public consent and support for us to be that incubator of great tech. And this is one of those issues where if we move quick, if we do it smart as a country, we'll get the benefits not only for economic growth and the tech industry, but also for our children and their future.
Dr. Danny Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer, for calling me to speak. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank the honourable member for securing this debate. It's really good to briefly chat to Kimberly Campbell just outside. You've done a great job getting this petition discussed today. I know it's something that thousands and thousands and thousands of parents around the country are really agonising over currently. I mean, we live in an era where social media connects us instantly, but this is often coming at quite a cost. And as the Lib Dem spokesperson for mental health, I knock on a lot of doors and I speak to a lot of parents and teachers and head teachers, and what is brought up often unprompted at the moment, one of the top issues is people struggling to get access for their children's mental health. And nearly everyone seems to agree throughout all of society, in whatever area you're in, that children's mental health issues are increasing in incidence. And everyone is reporting an increase in anxiety, depression, body image issues, as the member for East Hampshire mentioned, and they're all on the rise. And many people believe that they are fueled by platforms designed to capture and keep children's attention at any cost. And the risks go far beyond just self-esteem. Social media is an open door for strangers to make contact with vulnerable children. Grooming, exploitation and harmful content, they're just a few clicks away. Parents, despite their best efforts, has been mentioned by several people here today, struggle to keep up with the rapidly evolving digital landscape, because we know that children are often much quicker and more adaptable and very quick to circumnavigate any safeguards and workarounds, and they can quite quickly access restricted content and bypass age limits with ease. And we know that once one child in a cohort has managed to get hold of that content, they can then send it to other children very quickly and very easily. So that's why, along with nearly everyone here, we support reviewing the minimum age for social media access. Because in an environment where online bullying is relentless and inescapable, I mean, bullying has always taken place in schools, but people went home. And now you get home, you might be in bed, you might be having dinner, and the bullying can continue and continue, and you might even wake up in the morning to bullying that is coming overnight. We have to ensure that restrictions are not just appropriate and evidence-based, as far as they can be, but properly enforced. And there's been a lot of discussion about what age should be the minimum limit for social media access. But actually, it doesn't matter what the age is if the ages are not enforced by anyone. And at the moment, there is a minimum age, and we know that people younger than that minimum age are accessing this content anyway. So it's one reason, as I'm sure my honourable friend will be speaking about shortly, Liberal Democrats were calling for more of a public health approach to children's social media use. I've just spent a month sitting on the Tobacco and Vapes Bill Committee, going line by line through that legislation, which is one of the most impactful pieces of public health legislation to come through in decades. It's going to have a huge impact on public health, creating a smoke-free generation. As a government and as a society, we recognise the potential harmful behaviours that's smoking, gambling. They need to be appropriately regulated. And the Honourable Member reminded everyone very eloquently about the supposed research that tobacco companies carried out for years, just trying to obfuscate the real situation, pretending to add scientific value and knowledge, when really all it was trying to confuse the situation and slow any regulation on their products. Now, just like tobacco companies who prioritised profit over people's health, social media companies will prioritise profit and engagement over young people's mental health. Now, tech giants must be held accountable for the impact of their platforms in young minds. We do need stronger protections, real enforcement of age limits, and proper digital education. And that's not just for young people, but for parents and teachers too. All children will have to receive education on online safety and safer screen use to ensure they are equipped with the skills to safely navigate this digital world. Because when they do finally hit whatever age limit is deemed appropriate, they need to be prepared for that age limit. And they need to have the skills to be able to engage critically, safely, and responsibly with online content. Now, this is not about restricting freedom. It's about protecting young minds. It's about improving mental health of young people. And we've allowed the digital world to move faster than our policies. And now we really must act to keep up, because everyone agrees now that our children do deserve better than this. Thank you.
Mike Reader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stringer. A pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And thank you to the campaigners who brought forward this petition, and particularly to my constituent who I mentioned earlier for her tenacious campaigning on this regular surgery appointments and sharing some really fascinating research with me. While I do understand the concerns driving this debate, I don't believe that a blanket restriction set against an arbitrary age is necessarily the most effective way of protecting young people online. And whilst I do believe we need to protect young people and adults from the harms of social media, I want to set out today why I don't believe that an age restriction change is necessarily the best course of action. A huge proportion of our young people, use social media daily for research, to connect with friends and to explore the world. But already we know around 40% of kids under the age of 13 are using social media platforms. So that does suggest to me that age restrictions alone have limitations in practice. And it's worth noting that parental awareness of these age restrictions and requirements is mixed. Whilst 9 out of 10 parents of young kids have said they are aware, less than half in recent studies could actually pinpoint that 13 is the age of most sites. And really more concerning is that a third of parents with children below the current minimum age said they would still allow their kids to use social media. It shows that a blanket restriction won't work, and that we need to bring parents and young people along with us if we're going to make online spaces safer. These are concerning figures, and I say they're concerning because when we look at the impact of social media on young people, we see a really complex picture. On one hand, research suggests that over half of 12 to 15-year-olds have negative experiences online, and a magnitude of studies, as referenced by my honourable friend, have shown a heavy link between social media use and mental health concerns. And 7 out of 10 young people admit that they've experienced cyberbullying, with over a third reporting that on a frequent basis. And social media has been described as much more addictive than cigarettes and alcohol by some, so it's clear there are concerns. However, on the other hand, 90% of young people said that using social media makes them feel happier. It makes them feel closer to their friends. And during the pandemic, these platforms provide a crucial connection when face-to-face interaction simply wasn't possible. Social media has prompted a revolution in peer-to-peer interaction and sharing, and we as a government shouldn't do anything to stifle that growth and that grasp of creativity that our young people are showing. And it offers our young people an opportunity to read, watch and understand the experiences of others around the world like they never have before. So the real question is not simply whether young people under the age of 16 should be able to use social media. As the Honourable Member from East Hampshire recognised, social media isn't just TikTok and Snapchat, it's all the different ways that young people connect online. And even me when I get time to jump on the PlayStation. But the real question really is this. They are using it, and they're unlikely to stop using it, even if we brought in a ban. So what can we do to make it safer? Social media companies, schools and parents all have their role to play in creating safer online environments for our young people. And I do believe that social medias can do a lot more to moderate content and provide safer spaces for our young people. Harmful content that promotes self-harm, disordered eating, bullying, body image issues should not be making it onto online platforms. There has to be more accountability for the big tech giants. But parents also have to play a more active role in supervising and guiding their children's online activities. And research shows that around 6 in 10 parents are actually aware of the tools and the technical tools and social media controls that are available to them, and less than a third admit to actually using them to fully control how their kids use systems online. Of course.
As a parent of 4 teenagers, I do battle every single day on screen time. There's not a day that goes past, so much so that my children actually thought I was coming into Parliament to give screen time to the nation. Now, my point is, I think it is grossly unfair to not blame parents, but to give the responsibility to parents for this, when most parents are having this battle every single day, and with the addictive algorithms that are put into social media platforms, it's impossible for children to resist them. And just one more thing, I have a child who is 16, he was 16 last week. He's sitting his GCSEs at the moment. He's finding it very, very difficult to concentrate away from his phone and onto his studies because of these algorithms. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the intervention. I hope she doesn't misrepresent that I'm not saying it solely sits to the parents, but parents definitely have a clear role to play, and we can't look solely to the state to help raise our kids. But I'd also say that teachers have a big role to play in this. And my mum, included as a teacher, will tell you how important digital literacy is in this day and age. Children need the skills to navigate online spaces safely. And rather than solely focus on age restrictions, we should be considering how do we make social media platforms safe for kids so they can use it to improve that literacy, connect with the world and explore the opportunities that face them. And they should also be aware of the risks that they face, how to report harmful content and how to navigate these platforms safely. So I hope as the government looks at curriculum reform and how we support our schools and teachers and parents, that digital literacy plays even more of an important place in those reforms. Social media is now fully embedded in young people's lives. It offers the opportunity to connect for creative expression and for learning. And our challenge is to maximise those benefits whilst also minimising the risks, not to remove the opportunity altogether. Thank you.
Jack Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. You will struggle to find a member of this House that is more committed to classical liberal ideas surrounding individual liberty and personal responsibility than me. I do wish there were more of us, but when it comes to children, I very much agree with what the Honourable Member, I think, for Cheltenham said. The government's role really is very different. It's our job to protect children and to give them the skills that they need to be able to make decisions for themselves as they grow into adults. Now, that doesn't mean mollycoddling them or wrapping them in cotton wool, but there is a clear difference between a bloody knee or a playground argument and exposure to graphic violence and pornography that can be easily accessed on social media. As many members have already touched upon, anxiety levels in children are at an all-time high. Suicide, in particular, has increased dramatically. Since 2012, the rates have doubled in boys and trebled in girls. According to the Good Childhood Report, British children are now reporting some of the lowest happiness levels in Europe. And in my constituency, a Freedom of Information request submitted to the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead found that mental health referrals in children had doubled since the pandemic. The problems we are seeing are due, in large part, to smartphones and social media. As was stated in a recent Select Committee, the average 12-year-old now spends 21 hours a week on their phones. And as well as the obvious harms directly, indirectly, and I believe this is the point the Honourable Member for Whitehaven was making, these are hours in which they're not having formative experiences or interacting with the world around them. Experiences which our generation took for granted. I spent my early teens climbing trees and playing rugby, not staring at a screen, and something is being missed today in the healthy development of young people. What sets social media apart is the ability to circumvent traditional safeguards of parent, family and community, with children now exposed to the weight of the world from their bedrooms. Feeling unable to protect their children from the ills of social media, we are seeing many parents resort to banning phones entirely, which I don't think is very sustainable. Things need to change. By changing the law to limit under 16 access to social media, and I take my right honourable friend, the member for East Hampshire's point that that's easier said than done, we can work a way to give parents and our children a fighting chance. And whilst I believe changing the law will play a key role in reversing the fortunes of our children, we also need to make sure they are prepared for the challenges of modern life. As with many great initiatives discussed today, in Windsor, change has come from the bottom up. There is already a very active smartphone-free branch in my constituency, and parents have shared awful stories of hardcore pornography being circulated in primary school WhatsApp groups. But separately from the smartphone-free campaign, there is a wider movement around children's mental health. The Well Windsor charity in my constituency, which I would emphasise is neutral on this particular proposition, is unique in what it does, and I believe it could be the blueprint for change across the country. It was officially launched late last year by Andy Nuttall, along with 7 other parents who recognised there was a gap in state services when it came to children's mental health locally. But this is more than a cluster of well-meaning adults. The charity is run by individuals with a varied professional background, including former teachers, ex-CEOs, business leaders, as well as clinical psychologists. And they are proactive. They're raising funds, they're talking to schools, and they're delivering already for students. The data they have collected on mental health provision in schools in Windsor confirms what we already intuitively know. Parents and teachers feel underprepared to provide the necessary support when facing rising anxieties in children. So Well Windsor, sir, works with third parties like My Happy Mind to provide schools with programmes to help children check in with themselves, practice mindfulness, improve their resilience so they can face the modern world head-on. The NHS, local authorities and the DfE can often go round in circles directing children and parents from one service to another whilst children are left to fall by the wayside. Charities like Well Windsor go directly to the schools that need help and deliver it, not in a month's time, not in a year's time, but within weeks of discussions first taking place. Importantly, Well Windsor's approach is non-invasive, with a focus on positivity, self-esteem and general mindfulness. We should be careful about raising awareness for the sake of it, because the last thing suggestible children need is to be bombarded with information about depression, anxiety and mental health. That would be counterproductive. I also believe there can be a tendency to medicate away mental health problems in children. This can sometimes come at a cost of addressing the root causes of these problems in the first place, one of which is clearly social media. If we in this place can change the law, those in our communities who are taking matters into their own hands, I believe we could really help them turn around some of the trends which we're seeing. The only thing limiting this is political will and time, and I think most of us in this House on a cross-party basis would encourage the Minister to move forward in that direction. Communities across this country have had enough of the downward spiral in children's mental health. Parents, teachers and charities like Well Windsor are taking action. It's time we in this place did the same. Thank you.
Liam Conlon.
Thank you. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Stringer. This is an issue that's been raised by parents right across Beckenham and Penge, with over 600 constituents signing the recent petition, placing Beckenham and Penge as one of the top constituencies nationally in terms of signatures. We've also had one of the largest sign-ups for the smartphone-free childhood campaign. This includes an active local group that I've been working with, led by Crispin Eccleston, Elizabeth Eastham and Raj Gandhi. Hundreds of people have emailed me, it's come up on the doorstep, and it's been raised through local schools and local groups like the Scouts and Girl Guides. So I really welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Folkestone and Hyde, for securing it. We know that a growing number of children use smartphones on a daily basis. Technological advancements are a fact of life, and they are here to stay. Smartphones and new media applications are a means of communication, and they come with many benefits. Before I became an MP, I worked in the tech sector for 7 years, including as head of international operations for the global edtech firm Discovery Education, which teaches children coding and digital curriculum subjects. We want our children to be digitally native, confident in using technology, and able to harness it for their own benefit.
Mm-hmm.
We also want our children to be happy, healthy, and safe, to be aware of and resilient to the risks of social media and the world online. And I think it is finding this balance in what is relatively new territory for all of us that we are hoping to get to. There is a growing body of evidence that shows concern for the amount of time children and young people are spending online. A study published earlier this month from the University of Birmingham found that 12 to 15-year-olds in the UK now spend an average of 35 hours a week on their smartphone. That's the equivalent of having a full-time job. And all of that time spent online is not time spent interacting with family and friends face-to-face, playing outside, and building the social and emotional skills needed to form deep and meaningful relationships. It's also time when parents have very little idea what their children are viewing or who they are speaking to. Increasingly, we are coming to understand that giving our children unfettered access to the internet is a safeguarding risk. And we should think about this as not only giving our children access to the internet, but giving the internet access to our children. Over the weekend, I listened to a brilliant podcast on the BBC about Greystones, a small town in County Wicklow in Ireland, where a group of head teachers came together to work with parents who signed a voluntary pledge that they would delay buying phones for their children until at least age 11. One of the head teachers said, "You wouldn't let your child open the door to a room full of strangers and leave them in that room on their own. And unfortunately, that is happening when they have a smart device." The need for action is clear, and with solutions that are practical, proportionate, and can be implemented. And one of the things I think we risk doing is excluding children and young people from that conversation. That's why I recently held a student focus group at Harris Academy, Beckenham, and spoke to young people from every year group about the impact smartphones are having on their everyday lives. And I'd like to say thank you to students including Arek, Sarah and Rose for organising this alongside one of their fantastic teachers, Layla Hussein. Whilst the majority felt that the benefits of having a smartphone outweighed the downsides, over half of all the students present said that smartphones and social media overall have a negative impact on their mental health, and the same number admitted that they couldn't survive a week without a smartphone. When I asked them what they rely on their phones for, they said that it's help with schoolwork, chatting with friends, and filling the time. These were the top things on their list. When I asked them what they'd be most excited for if they had a phone-free day, their responses included going to the park, walking the dog, spending time with family, playing music, and making art. All things I'm sure we'd eagerly encourage our children to do more of. Overall, the students gave a balanced view. While all were clued up on the risks and agreed that social media needed properly enforced age limits, they also saw the positive role it can play if used in moderation and with the right protections. Listening to different perspectives is really important in this debate, and we should also respect the idea that in the large, parents know what is best for their children. I strongly believe that the best approach will be community-focused, working as a community, creating voluntary codes and pacts, means that we can support parents in schools and bring them with us. I believe it is clear to parents this is coming from a place of concern rather than a place of judgment, that we share their fears and we need to work together to address them. And I pay tribute to the work of Smartphone-Free Childhood, who have secured recent wins in Barnet, Southwark, Ealing and many more areas across London and the rest of the country. I hope to learn from those examples in Beckenham and Penge as I continue to work with parents groups, local schools and students to find a way forward that will mean children and young people can lead happy, healthy and carefree childhoods whilst attaining all the benefits the digital world offers. This also includes a meeting next week at Harris Academy Beckenham on Monday, which will bring these stakeholders together. But I also look forward to continuing to push social media companies to take greater responsibility across a range of areas, including age verification and the sort of content children and young people are being exposed to on a daily basis. And I strongly believe in the principle as well of reverse burden, which was made really well by the Right Honourable Member for East Hampshire when he said that we wouldn't take this approach to children's toys or food. I'd like to say thank you again to my honourable friend, the member for Folkestone and Hyde, for securing this debate, and the Minister for his time too.
Caroline Voden.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to pay tribute to Kim and the other petitioners for bringing this petition to the House. So, in the government's response to the petition, DSIT referred to a systematic review by the UK's Chief Medical Officer in 2019, which does not show a causal link between screen-based activities and mental health problems, though some studies have found associations with increased anxiety or depression. Therefore, the government is focused on building the evidence base to inform any future action. But this review is 6 years old now, and I would like to ask the government, how much evidence do you need? Things have changed radically in the last 6 years, and we're living in a very, very different digital world to the one we were living in 2019. So some of the evidence I've read in preparation for this debate includes a 65% rise in mental health admissions to hospital. This is all among under 18s. A staggering 638% increase in admissions for eating disorders among girls of 11 to 15. A 50% rise in childhood myopia, an increase of 56% in ADHD diagnosis since the widespread adoption of smartphones, an increase of 27% in just the last 2 years in the number of children with speech and language challenges, and a rise in obesity which sees around a quarter of children leaving primary school now judged to be overweight or clinically obese. Evidence from the UK, from Japan, Canada, Australia, it's all there and it's growing. As many other members have said, you look at smoking, you look at alcohol, we protect our children. We don't allow them to buy it because we know the damage it can do. Just because the damage of mental health is not quite as visible as a damaged lung or a damaged liver due to sclerosis, just because you can't see it and measure it and photograph it, it doesn't mean that that evidence isn't there. We can see it all around us. This morning I spent some time talking to the mental health leads in Devon, and they talked about the difficulty in employing enough psychologists and psychiatrists to cope with the mental health crisis among the children in Devon. So this was about children's mental health. All the vacancies they have and the ever-increasing need, just get growing and growing and growing, the need of children for mental health support. And while it's right that we give children the mental health care they need, that they're asking for and that parents are asking for, surely we have to look at this the other way around and say we have to stop this rising trend. We have to look at the cause. We have to turn it on its head. We owe it to our children. And as the Honourable Member for Whitehaven and Workington said, the graphs all show that this started in 2012. And for the sake of our teachers who are trying to cope with this ever-increasing pressure of special educational needs, autism spectrum disorders and so on, I really think that the time has come for us to act, not to start looking for more evidence. Mr Chair, I believe it's time that we use the precautionary principle on smartphones. It enables decision makers to adopt precautionary measures when the scientific evidence about an environmental or human health hazard is uncertain, but the stakes are high, and we know the stakes are high for our children. Some may see this as unscientific and an obstacle to progress, but to me it's an approach that can, and in this situation must be used to protect the health of our youngest humans. DSIT said the Online Safety Act puts a range of new duties on social media companies and search services, making them responsible for their users' safety with the strongest provisions in the Act for children. Platforms likely to be accessed by children will have a duty to take steps to prevent children from encountering the most harmful content, such as pornography, and content that encourages, promotes, or provides instructions for self-harm, eating disorders, or suicide. We all know that we can't trust the tech companies to do this. It's not in their interest. They have developed addictive apps so that our children are kept on them, are using them hour after hour after hour. It's not in their interest to change their... I don't believe it's in their interest to do what's required to protect our children. And where in that code is a restriction of content that perpetuates the myths of the perfect body? That's not hardcore content like online pornography or suicidation videos. It's the subtle stuff of social media. It's the addictiveness of it that is really dangerous. And my concern is about the long hours that children are spending on screens, the time spent indoors instead of playing with friends, and as we've said, making real human connection. But there's one thing that I think is even worse, and it's not really what we're talking about the teenage use, but we now know that 25% of 3 to 4-year-olds in the UK own a smartphone. Tiny children looking at a screen rather than interacting with other humans. Children who are not learning to speak and communicate, because babies don't learn from a machine. They're captivated by the videos, but they're not learning how to communicate with other humans. Older children are not experiencing boredom. I mean, we all remember standing at bus stops, right? You didn't have a mobile phone. You got bored. You looked at the sky. You looked around you. You watched other people. It's part of a development of a human brain. Have you ever seen a teenager standing at a bus stop now getting bored? It just doesn't happen. So I'd like to leave the last word with John Gallagher, who's the Professor of Cognitive Health at Oxford University, who said, "We found a linear relationship between higher rates of anxiety and depression and time spent on social media sites. In the most extreme cases, we had young people reporting that they were spending up to 8 hours a day using these sites." We must find a way to change this for our children. I don't believe in a ban on smartphones. I don't think that's workable, but I do believe that we have to raise the minimum age for social media use. We have to change the conversation. We have to give parents the support they need so that the peer pressure is not to have phones rather than to have phones. And we have to support all those schools who are being really brave and pushing this and trying to eradicate this problem from their teenagers. So I fully commend the petition, and I think cross-party, we really need to do something about this.
Sarah Russell.
Thank you, and it's an honour to serve under your chairmanship, Mr. Stringer. I did a lot of research before I prepared this speech today, and I have to say what I found really alarmed me as a parent of 3 primary-aged children. So the NSPCC report that there were over 7,000 sexual communication with children offences last year, that was a significant increase on the year before. They say that the typical way in which these offences are perpetrated is that the perpetrators start to talk to the children on fairly mainstream web services, and then they start to encourage the children to communicate with them instead on more private messaging services, so typically Snapchat, WhatsApp, Instagram. I was pretty shocked. I did not appreciate that this was such a widespread problem, and we all know that if there were 7,000 offences reported to the police, that there will have been a considerably larger number that actually happened. Another thing that I discovered was the prevalence of dating app usage amongst children, and that there are children who are then experiencing terrible offences against them when they then go on to meet people who were in fact adults who were preying on them. I think we need to understand fundamentally that when we're talking about social media, that children are a product. That if anything that you use on the internet doesn't cost any money, then the gain to the person who's providing it to you is having access to your thoughts, your feelings, your communications, and in this case it's our children's thoughts, their feelings, their communications with their friends. That we have a generation now who their entire lifespan, often from very young ages, those thoughts, those feelings and those communications with their friends can be monetized, can be tracked across multiple different websites or social media apps, and that the picture and the complexity of the picture that these companies have of our children is incredibly sophisticated, and that the ability to therefore target content at them is like nothing we've ever even imagined. There's also a problem with parents inadvertently facilitating some of this stuff. So when a parent quite naively, and I would count myself to some extent within this description, so it's certainly not a judgmental one, when a parent says that a child is 13 so that they can access something which I would broadly have considered fairly uncontroversial, like WhatsApp, so they can chat to their friends. If they do that, then there's an aging risk that is created throughout the lifespan of that app usage. So children, and it was mentioned previously, children then subsequently appear to be 18 before they actually are, or appear to be 16 before they actually are, and therefore obtain access to services that are not safe for them much younger than they otherwise would have done. And that the parents who do this don't appreciate the aging risk that they're creating potentially several years down the line. The NSPCC says that we have a really fundamental problem here. We obviously now have the Online Safety Act brought by party opposite, and we're working very hard as a government to facilitate bringing that into force. And Ofcom have been given a significant role in looking at child risk assessment by the online providers. But I think we all know that if those people had the best interests of children at heart, a lot of the things that Ofcom are requiring of them, they would have done already. The fact that Ofcom is having to do an investigation into OnlyFans and their ability or willingness to prevent underage children from seeing sexualised content on OnlyFans does not sit comfortably, I think would be the kind of minimum I'd put on it. So I think I'm not quite sure, though, if I'm honest, quite what the right solution is to the problems that we're seeing here. Because if we don't get societal consensus as to what the right solution is, then what we'll carry on seeing is parents who are, for instance, helping children to circumnavigate age restrictions, and children who are using VPNs in order to circumnavigate them themselves, because plenty of teenagers are plenty sophisticated enough to do that. So I'm not sure what the right answer is. I'm not sure that preventing under 16-year-olds from accessing this content will solve it. I think actually there's a risk that it creates a false sense of security and also enables providers of these facilities and apps to say, well, under 16-year-olds can't use it, so we don't have to put any safety features in because children aren't allowed it anyway. They're completely abdicating responsibility. So I think it is important that we keep talking about these issues. I think it is important that we move forward on a cross-party basis. I think these are really sophisticated problems, and I'm not sure whether or not we have a sufficiently sophisticated response to them at the moment. I think the Online Safety Act does provide us with a lot of tools, and I can see that the potential fines under it of 10% of global revenue are really quite high, and that does have the potential to drive some behaviour change, provided the companies involved really see that they have teeth. And I do hope that we will be monitoring Ofcom and how they get on with this new legislation very, very heavily. And I'm sure the House will, all parties will be interested in that. So to finish, I just, my friend, the Honourable Member for Folkestone and Hyde, said, he spoke to his children before he came here today and raised that he was going to talk about these issues. I raised it with my children over breakfast this morning as well, and one of them berated me for not having been in her online safety assembly. I think we have to be realistic about the capacity of both parents and schools to actually manage these issues without making this be a blame game between different organisations, parents versus schools versus major corporations. These corporations have a huge vested interest in exploiting our children, and we have to figure out how best to protect them.
Thank you.
Gregor Poynton.
Thank you, Mr Vickers. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I speak as the chair of the APPG for Children's Online Safety, but contribute today on my own behalf. Mr Vickers, the opportunities and perils of social media is an issue that increasingly is weighing on the minds of parents, of educators, of society, and above all, young people themselves. My friend, the Honourable Member for Beckham and Penge, spoke about balance, and I think balance is one of the key issues that we are discussing today, because our young people require the digital skills and digital literacy in order to access the modern world, be it through the world of work or increasingly public services or even their social lives. But we need to give them the tools in which to do that, and this is, I think, has been a useful debate today to think about how we do it. But we can see the strength of feeling about this particular measure being reflected in the parliamentary petition that we're discussing. A petition signed by 92 of my own Livingston constituents, and that speaks to the widespread anxieties of the impact of social media on our children and young people. You know, these concerns are real, they're heartfelt, and coming not only from parents and communities, but also from the young people themselves, which are having to navigate these digital landscapes every single day. They tell us that social media is not merely a tool for that connection, but it's a space where the line between reality and illusion often is blurred, where photoshopped images and curated lifestyles can distort self-perception. I'm convinced of the merits of enforcing a minimum age requirement of 16 for social media on the Australian model. I'm in favour on mental health grounds, with social media shown in study after study to be linked to increased anxiety, depression and low self-esteem for young people. I'm in favour on online safety grounds, with social media exposing children to cyberbullying, predators, misinformation and harmful content. And I'm in favour to try and reverse children's decreasing attention spans, as we need to give our kids the support they need to focus, to learn and to reach their full potential. I do believe, however, it's vital not to leave young people out of these conversations, but to centre on their concerns and experiences. I spoke just the other week to academic colleagues at the University of Manchester who stressed the complexity and variety of young people's views on these subjects, having conducted a whole series of research, including focus groups, to understand how children use social media and what it means to them in their lives. They've also pointed out that a key concern of those young people and those focus groups, short of a ban, was the capacity to better distinguish between content which is real and which is faked or manipulated or highly curated. And it wasn't so much around disinformation or misinformation that they raised. It was more about those perfect lifestyles that are shown on Instagram and other platforms that is more, as one honourable member mentioned, is more sort of insidious rather than easy to ban, but it would have a real effect on them and their perceptions of themselves and their lives. And this also brings me to the role of social media companies. Many honourable friends have mentioned them in this debate, and I think it's right to say that they have not taken enough responsibility for the content that is on their sites. The incentive at the moment is very much to let loose and for eyeballs and time spent, rather than to make sure that that is properly moderated and the content is going to the right people. Because we already have various minimum age restrictions in place, but the challenge has been to enforce that, and social media companies must adhere and enforce them. So with or without a ban, we do need more effective oversight and accountability how these platforms operate. I think there's also a vital role for industry leaders such as Google and Apple through their app stores. These gatekeepers possess significant influence and could do much more to ensure that age verification and content moderation is robust and reliable. Yeah. Honourable members have also mentioned smartphone bans, and I was really pleased at the weekend at the Scottish Labour Conference to see Ines Arwar, our leader in Scotland, will be in our manifesto for the 2026 Scottish parliamentary elections that will ban mobile phone use in Scottish schools. I think that gives parents and educators and children themselves the clarity in what we think is right and what we do not think is right, and actually having phones in schools I don't believe is right for the children themselves and for the educators trying to do their jobs. So, Mr Vickers, in conclusion, I believe that the minimum age of social media is an idea which time has come. For me, it's a matter of protection, ensuring we best we can prepare young people mentally, emotionally, to handle the pressures that social media bring. Even without a ban, however, I believe that today that we must ensure that existing age limits are being properly and rigorously enforced, and we must engage robustly with the tech companies to ensure they're doing all they can to protect our young people and our children.
Irene Campbell.
great privilege to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Vickers, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Folkestone and Hythe, for securing this debate and for his excellent speech. And I'd like to thank Kim Campbell and the other petitioners who have brought this to this debate today. I recently met with one of my constituents in North Ayrshire and Arran, Sam Rice, who was able to tell me about the charity he set up called Kids for Now. He was extremely concerned in relation to a lot of what's actually been discussed today, so I won't repeat that. But he shared with me the work of his campaign, and it's all about smartphones and social media use in children. And he set up an organisation called Kids for Now, which is a grassroots movement which connects parents within the UK to help delay smartphones together. So it's not really about banning them entirely, but it's about delaying the use of smartphones. And it's about working on campaigns calling for child-safe phones in the UK. He very much mentioned that, but I'm not sure that young people probably want the old-style phones that we all used to use and not have a smartphone like the rest of their peer group. He mentioned banning smartphones in Scottish schools, and the Honourable Member for Livingston has just stolen my line on that as well, because we were delighted that this was actually a pledge that was made at the Labour conference in Glasgow at the weekend. So that was very, very positive. And Sam, the constituent, also spoke about making primary schools internet free. Now, a lot of this is obviously up for debate. But what he said to me was that he helps parents take positive collective action against peer pressure and challenges the norm of young children feeling like they need social media. And we've discussed a lot of that today as well, about other things you can do while standing at a bus stop. And clearly, when I was growing up, there were clearly no mobile phones, so that was not a distraction we were ever going to have. But it's really important, though, that we actually have time for our children to maybe be children. He was extremely concerned about, and this has been discussed today, about the mental and emotional health of children. And, for example, research from the project Delay Smartphones found that children can no longer have any respite from bullies at home, as has already been mentioned. And now they said a shocking 84% of bullying to children with smartphones actually happens online. And that's a huge figure. And additionally, smartphones and social media are more likely to expose children to sexual and offensive content, and this can include young people being pressured into sending sexual images of themselves. And for example, Ofsted found that 80% of teenage girls are being put under pressure to provide images of themselves. And I think when we look at a strategy tackling violence in women, for violence in women against girls, this needs to be considered. Because of the damage that access to social media can actually have on young girls. So it's really important to consider young people's safety on the internet in a time where technology is constantly evolving and changing. And I'm really pleased that this debate's taking place to allow for further consideration of where we go with this conversation. And I look forward to hearing the Minister's response on the future of smartphone and social media legislation.
Who's next? Sam Rushworth.
And can I thank the British public for bringing this petition forward so that we can debate it today, and those who've led on this. And I think it comes from a place of real strong feeling amongst parents. This isn't some blind moral panic. This is lived experience of anybody who has raised a teenager in the last few years. My wife and I spend a lot of our time discussing our own parenting, and like I think many parents, we agonise over whether or not we're getting it right. On the one hand, wanting to not be too autocratic and wanting to give our children the freedom to engage in a social space that their friends are in, whilst also seeing and knowing that we're allowing them access to something that we believe is causing them damage. And can I also thank the member for Whitehaven and Workington for what I thought was an excellent speech, really setting out the strong evidence base for why it's imperative that we as a Parliament act. And there's been some excellent speeches from across all the parties in this place today. And I think it's because, and I was reflecting, were I to ever be fortunate enough to place where he is in the private member's ballot, what if I could do one thing to improve our country right now, what would I do? And I think he's got it right. I think it has to be about what we do to protect the next generation. Because, and it's not cliche to say that they are all our futures, and that we face an epidemic of youth mental unwellness today that's holding back a generation. We know the damage, and many people have spoken well today about the damage that social media is doing to our children. Apps that are designed to addict, to require you to get streaks. And this affects concentration, and we know this. An overconnectedness that's driving anxiety and disrupting children's sleep. Content that distorts children's relationship with reality about body and about lifestyle, and which is damaging to self-esteem. Content which, I'd say, the fact that some of these sites don't host explicitly pornographic material in the sense that certain body parts are covered, often children are overexposed to a general timbre of content which is still sexualising the human body and causing them to think in sexualised terms at a young age. The challenge of apps that are designed for children to communicate through images, which is driving the phenomenon known as sexting. And despite schools' valiant efforts to teach children not to do this, we know that it's happening, and it's happening at a worrying scale. And we also know that children are overconnected to a social space which is completely unsupervised, where they can encounter humiliation and bullying. I had a conversation not long ago with a child and asked the question, well, why don't you just not go online? But the response came back, because I need to know what people are saying about me. As the Honourable Member for East Hampshire posed a question earlier, if young people were asked, if we could switch this off for everyone, would you? Lots of them would actually say, yes, I would. But there's this phenomenon, my teenagers tell me it's called FOMO, fear of missing out. That means that they have to simultaneously be in a space whilst not wanting to be in that space all the time. Because where in our generation, you could find school difficult, but you could go home from school and you could switch off. For many children today, it's the first thing that they experience when they wake up in the morning is the notifications from the night before. And it's the last thing they see when they go to bed at night. So I think we do need to regulate. And we regulate childhood already in various ways to protect children. Laws which prevent children from going to nightclubs. The requirement for DBS checks to protect children from coming into contact with adults around whom they wouldn't be safe. And even film classification ratings. There's a huge industry around this, and yet the content that children can access on Facebook, were it to be classified by a film classifier, we would say that they're not old enough often to be seeing that regular content. And as the Honourable Member for Basingstoke said earlier, many children and young people actually agree with the benefits of limiting social media. Before I was in this place, one of the roles I had was to tutor in various North East high schools. And often our conversation in seminars would turn to this challenge of mental health. And a lot of young people talk to me about how simultaneously they can feel lonely whilst also being overly connected and not having a place to switch off. Girls at Teesdale School, which was my first visit as a new Member of Parliament, also talked to me about a changing in attitudes that they saw amongst many of the young men that they go to school with. Increase in misogyny in the way that the young men would treat them because of far-right content that those young men were accessing. So what can be done? people have spoken for and against an outright ban, and I think that there are merits to all of those arguments, actually. And some have highlighted the challenge of simply banning things. Having said that, we do need to consider an age of consent. And we need, I think, not just a legal shift, but a cultural shift. Greater parental controls and greater support for parents to supervise what their children are viewing. Perhaps time limit controls that force a child to be switched off. Education does already exist, but we know that it's not yet effective. And perhaps we need an education that looks not just at the don'ts, at the warnings to young people, but also at the do's, a reimagining of childhood. We need to provide fewer virtual experiences and more real experiences for our children. I think about my own childhood, learning an instrument, after-school sports, riding my bike around the block, attending a weekly youth club, going for a walk and bopping along to my Walkman. And yes, also being bored, being able to just take in the world around me. We also need, children need more family time, and I think we need to be real that one of the things that's driving this smartphone use in children, and every parent feels the guilt around this, is that parents are often less present in their children's lives. This is why I was proud to support Usda's campaign to keep Sunday special with relation to Sunday trading laws. And it's why I support flexible working and other laws, thinking about the world of work to make sure that families can have time together. So in conclusion, there are many things that need to be considered, but what I think we all agree on is that we cannot allow the status quo to continue, and that it is imperative that as a parliament and as a government that we consider how to better safeguard our children's future.
Thank you, Mr. Vickers, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm really grateful to be able to have the opportunity to speak in this debate, because the safety of young people online is possibly one of the most pressing challenges of our time. Now, I have a confession to make. I hate social media, but I feel compelled to use it. It cannot be understated that social media is now inescapably the reality of modern life. And for young people, it plays a role in how they interact with the world, how they form their identities, and how they access information. I do not for a second dispute that it is a tool with extraordinary power for connection, for education, and for creativity. But increasingly, it is becoming a space where harm can be profound, persistent, and deeply damaging. And yet, legislative change has not kept up with the pace of social media growth. As a society, we are still playing catch-up to the impact of social media, and we're just not doing it fast enough. As my honourable friend, the member for Whitehaven and Workington, detailed, there is much debate on the evidence base that surrounds this. But I think something that we can all agree on is that, alongside the numerous studies, that we are very much exposed to declining mental health in adolescents, the rising cases of anxiety, depression, and self-harm. Algorithms are designed to drive engagement on platforms. They do not prioritise well-being, but instead they prioritise views, clicks, and your attention. It is easy to see how our children become passive observers to extreme content and harmful trends, when harmful material does not need to be sought, but instead is delivered to their phones. And unfortunately, it does not just stop at the exposure. The dangerous reality of an online world is one which has become a hunting ground for those that seek to manipulate and exploit. We have seen the rise of online grooming, facilitated by the anonymity of fake profiles. We see ourselves in a situation where children are being targeted in their own homes through their own devices by individuals who have never had easier access to them. I understand why parents are worried, because since being elected, I have received numerous correspondence from concerned parents in Gillingham and Rainham who just want their children to exist and go through life free from harm. I appreciate that's something that everybody wants, but the risk to their children, as they perceive, is now beyond the sanctuary of their own home. They see no pause, no protection, and no escape. Now, while I do support a review of the age for social media access, and I think there is certainly a need to look at that in closer detail, I don't think it's a quick fix that will solve the issues that we face at this point. And I would encourage everyone here to go and speak to your average 15-year-old, as I'm sure some of you already have done, as you've detailed in the speeches today. You'll find very quickly that they are extremely capable of being inventive and circumventing the rules. This is what teenagers have done since immemorial. The fundamental problem is that these platforms were never designed with the safety of children in mind. We would be doing our children a disservice to raise a legal barrier and simply hope that the risk then disappears, because that's not what's going to happen. Children do deserve more. They deserve more responsibility from social media companies, more urgency from regulators, and perhaps more action from us as elected to this House. The Online Safety Act is a huge step in the right direction under the previous government, but we must ensure that the protections are not diluted to the point where obligations are only placed on platforms where they are seen the least burdensome. Harm reduction for our children must remain the fundamental priority. So I welcome this government's commitment to working with Ofcom to effectively implement the 2023 Act so that children are benefiting from the protections as soon as possible. But clearly the legislation alone is not going to be enough, and we've heard the powerful speeches about cultural change. Implementation must also come at speed with determination. Ofcom are now armed with new regulatory powers. They must move at pace to protect our children from the very harms that colleagues across the House have spoken about time and time again, and we've got to get this right. My constituents in Gillingham and Rainham are particularly interested in the measures such as user identity verification, and ensuring that that is sped up so that adults and children can benefit from the protections alike. We need to send out a really clear signal that delays will not be tolerated, that platforms need to be held to account. And varying platforms do this to different degrees. Some are much better than others, but all of them still have a long way to go. Online safety should not be a distant ambition, but an immediate necessity, because every day that action is being delayed, there's another young person who's being exposed to harm, and we've got to prevent that. So I want to end by thanking the member for Folkestone and Hythe for securing this debate today, because it's been so incredibly important that we continue this conversation, but also to the Minister for his time in being here and hopefully listening to the very powerful representations that have been made in this room.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Mr Vickers. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship. I should like to start by setting out some facts and figures before moving on to the substance of my speech. 71% of children report having experienced harm online. 21% of children report having been contacted online by adults that they do not know. Vulnerable children are twice as likely to encounter online bullying than their peers. 57% of parents report that their children's sleep patterns are being negatively affected by online activity. And here's the killer stat. Despite the 13-year-old threshold, 85% of 9 to 12-year-olds are reported to use social media. It's obvious, given that merely an increase in the threshold to 16 years of age is insufficient. There is a job of enforcement that needs to go hand in hand. Many members in this debate have concentrated on the harms to children, and quite rightly. My honourable friend, the member for Whitehaven and Workington, somewhat stole my thunder by talking so eloquently about the analogy with smoking from the 1950s. I have truncated my speech accordingly.
Go again.
But it's accurate. We are now at the stage where social media usage is analogous to smoking in, say, the 1950s. There is obvious harm being done, but we're not yet at a stage where we can accurately quantify it or categorise it or come to a settled conclusion on how to deal with it. Evidence continues to emerge around harmful content, around sleep patterns, around the mental health of children, around addictiveness and more. And yet we are not there as a society or as a government and as Parliament and as politicians in yet knowing how to adequately deal with all of this. So as a starting point, I support moves to increase age restrictions in line with the petitioners. But I think that we need to learn more about the causality of so many of the problems that we're seeing in our younger generations and finding out how to prevent them for future generations. So in addition to an increase in the age limit, I want to see greater enforcement of age limit through Ofcom and through self-regulation from social media companies themselves. And we also need more high-quality, robust research to prove causality beyond any doubt. I will finish by mentioning one aspect of the debate which I believe hasn't been touched on by colleagues. I mentioned in the House last week around how there is increasingly a political element whereby social media companies are reflecting the national interest of the host countries in which they are situated. Yeah. There are national interest considerations for the UK around regulation of social media. We don't want foreign agents and foreign actors to be influencing our democratic process in relation to adults. And so I will end by saying that we certainly do not want foreign actors influencing the formation of the politics of our children either. Thank you, Mr. Vickers.
Lib Dem spokesman Victoria Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Vickers. It is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. We are here today because over 128,000 people across the UK signed a petition calling for social media companies to be banned from letting children under 16 create accounts. This reflects a deep and growing concern among parents and professionals about the impact of social media on our children's well-being. And I thank Kim Campbell for launching that debate and members across the chamber today for their input to today's debate and a consensus for action. At the heart of this call on social media companies to be banned from letting children under 16 create accounts is a mental health crisis which calls for a public health emergency response. The evidence is stark, as eloquently highlighted by the MP for Whitehaven and Workington and reinforced by the MP for Winchester. Between 2016 and 2024, child contact with mental health services increased by 477%, rising from 96,000 to 458,000 cases, and those are the ones reaching out to mental health services. There has been a 5-fold increase in eating disorders among 11 to 16-year-olds, particularly affecting girls. Our young people are struggling, and the role of social media cannot be ignored. Speaking to young people in schools across Harpenden and Berkhamsted in my local area, young men and women alike are worried about the content they're consuming and the impact it has on them and their friends. Young people have told me about the concern they have for mental health, and young men told me they are seeing things they do not want to see. Young girl guides have told me that they worry about bullying and the online harm and the impact it's having on the young men around them. Many parents have written to me about their concerns, and that's also why I also launched a Safer Screens tour to listen to young people firsthand, as well as parents, teachers, and will be listening to healthcare professionals too. The current system is fundamentally broken. Social media platforms remain easily accessible to young children despite having minimum age limits, and social media companies must go further to implement those age limits, as the MP for Reigate highlighted. Even more concerning, these platforms' own designs actively work against child safety. They're built with features that nudge children to share photos, videos, and location data. Indeed, all of us have been victims of those nudges. Their recommender systems can push harmful content from extreme dieting to self-harm continuously to vulnerable young users. The Online Safety Act, while a step forward, has critical gaps, particularly in addressing these addictive design features. As the MP for Folkestone and Hythe highlighted, this is the Wild West. And I know the MP for Darlington has done a lot of work on this and has reinforced this too. While the Online Safety Act has made important progress on harmful content, it has failed to address the fundamental issue, the addictive architecture of those platforms itself. As the MP for South Devon highlighted, these are not neutral tools, they're precision-engineered addiction machines. Every pull to refresh, every infinite scroll, every notification is designed to trigger dopamine pathways similar to gambling or substance abuse. As research from the University of Sussex shows, teen social media binges mirror social media seen in drug addiction. And I absolutely welcome the work that the MP and Whitehaven and Workington has done and the work he's doing to push forward his private members bill to address this. Between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 young people now show behaviours consistent with problematic smartphone use, and it is not an accident, it is by design. And that design puts profit before children's well-being. As the MP for East Hampshire highlighted, we also should look at what other countries are doing. Australia is moving to ban social media for under 16 entirely. Norway is raising the age of consent for data processing to 15 and developing a robust age verification system. France has passed new law requiring parental consent for minors under 15. These countries recognise, as the petition does, that we must act decisively to protect our children. That's why the Liberal Democrats are calling for an explicit public health approach to children's social media use. Just as we eventually recognise that cigarettes and gambling products need strict regulation, as the MP for Cheltenham, the MP for Whitehaven and Workington has highlighted, we must now acknowledge those social medias require similar oversight. But let me be clear, this is not just about social media, but age-appropriate experience across the online world. We also cannot ignore other reasons why children are gravitating to phones. As the MP for Bishop Auckland highlighted, if youth clubs are closed, if sports facilities are underfunded, or if safe community centres are out of reach, the path of least resistance is to spend hours online. A real shift in tackling screen overuse must also include supporting these third spaces, providing well-funded, welcoming spots where young people can socialise, explore hobbies and simply be children. Absolutely.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and related to that point, I wonder if she shares my concern about one of what seems to be a growing phenomenon in my area of Fife, where young people are committing violent acts of crime and filming themselves doing that and then sharing it through social media. Last month we saw an attack on a young boy in Cowdenbeath by a group of other youths. They filmed it and shared it on Snapchat. And I wonder if she agrees with me that that's why, whilst raising the online age of consent to 16 wouldn't solve that problem completely and it would need to be properly enforced, it would be an important first step in tackling this kind of harm.
Thank you to the Right Honourable Member, and I'm so sorry to hear about what's happening in Fife, and I'm sure there are members across the House who see that impact. And that's the thing, I think there's the online social media which reinforces the negative image of actually what or changing social norms, but actually this is a wider problem as well, but there are indeed first important steps that need to be taken. And indeed, so providing those well-funded, welcoming spots where young people can socialise, explore hobbies and simply be children without the allure of endlessly scrolling feed, or indeed sharing those viral images that reinforce those dopamine hits is an important side as well. Investing in after-school programmes, libraries and youth clubs not only gives children alternative outlets, it also strengthens mental health, builds social skills and eases the pressure on parents to supervise screen time every minute. In short, offline opportunities are just as crucial as any digital safeguard. To tackle the public health emergency and mental health for young people, we need 3 immediate actions. First, the establishment of a Safer Screens task force empowered to ensure a public health approach to children's social media is taken across all government departments, examining international best practice and developing comprehensive solutions. This includes ensuring measures for protective defaults on phones and other connected devices, looking at safety by design, such as no infinite scrolling, no notifications at night, and no addictive engagement algorithms, unless explicitly enabled by a parent. Second, all children should receive standalone education on online safety and safer screens at each key stage. Our children and parents need to be equipped with skills to navigate this digital world. Third, we must also expand safe third spaces to give young people a true alternative to being on their screens. I started my uni days without social media and ended with it. It's worrying to say that was 20 years ago. So this is not an overnight phenomenon, but a debate that has been a long time in the making. The government has stated that a ban on under 16 social media use is on the table. Now is the time to look carefully at international precedents and bring forward whatever measures will be effective, practical and implementable to keep our children safe. We of course need to protect parents' rights to make decisions, but let's be clear, we already accept age restrictions on activities that can harm children's development. We don't let under 18s gamble or buy cigarettes. We have age ratings on films and video games, as members have mentioned. We cannot allow our children's developing minds to be left at the mercy of platforms deliberately designed to be addictive by design. Parents are crying out for support. They want help from the government and industry in managing their children's online safety. We simply must get this right. Whether the answer is an outright ban at 16, as this petition suggests, age-appropriate experiences across the digital landscape, or a robust system of graduated access with proper age assurances and parental oversight, one thing is clear: the status quo is failing our children. Thank you.
Hello, Minister. Benedict.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Vickers. I would like to thank the Petitions Committee for enabling this debate, to Kim Campbell for launching this petition, and the Honourable Member for Folkestone and Hythe for opening it, and to the 128,000 signatories to the petition, including 225 people from my own constituency of Huntingdon. In a recent survey of over 2,000 parents by More in Common, social media and excessive screen time was ranked as the top issue affecting children's mental well-being. Parents ranked it higher than alcohol, bullying and financial problems in the list of threats. Exposure to harmful content online was deemed the second biggest risk to mental health. The challenges facing children have changed astronomically in recent years. Children now face a boiling point of addiction, constant connectivity, online crime and harmful content. Many feel it has become too much for children to handle. The evidence base is growing stronger. Smartphones and social media are adversely impacting our children's mental health. The Royal Society for Public Health say that around 70% of young people now report that social media increases their feelings of anxiety and depression. And in increasing numbers, children are coming into schools up and down the UK having stayed up all night on their phones. A child who has not had a healthy night's sleep is not equipped to contribute to the classroom, except perhaps to disrupt it. Evidence from health professionals for safer screens show children who routinely spend extended periods of time on their smartphones have poorer eyesight, inhibited speech and language development, interrupted sleep, and raising rates of anxiety. Smartphones are designed to be addictive. Platforms are constantly seeking to develop new design strategies that encourage children to stay online for longer. Notifications, comments and likes are designed to drive feelings of happiness, and it is easy for children to feel obliged to engage and even compete with their peers online. Of course, children access social media on mobile phones via the internet. Individually, each tool brings its own benefits. Mobile phones allow children to let parents know that they've reached school safely, providing an extra safeguard that allows them greater and earlier independence. The internet itself allows children to further their education, whether through research tasks, homework or practicing coding. It also provides better connectivity, information and entertainment. The internet is so integral to society, we must ensure that children have the skill set and know how to navigate it. Turning to social media, I expect many honourable members use it every day, scrolling through their social media feeds, checking the news or drafting an update to their constituents. Of course, social media has its benefits, not least because it allows us to communicate with people instantly, en masse, wherever they may be in the world. Used responsibly, social media can provide some benefits for children. Children may use it to stay connected with friends and family around the world. They may use it for civic engagement or to fundraise. They may use YouTube or short reels for online learning or content discovery, perhaps. But the drawbacks are considerable. An addiction to their screen, yes. Online bullying, yes. Exposure to harmful content like eating disorders, self-harm and body shaming, yes. There is some bad content on the internet. It is deeply concerning that half of 13-year-olds reported seeing hardcore misogynistic pornographic material on social media sites. There are widespread concerns this is impacting the way young people understand healthy relationships, sex and consent. Half of parents worry that online pornography is giving their children an unrealistic view of sex. We also see this with knife crime, with constant exposure to content which glamorises violence and exposes children to a world of criminality, gangs and scoreboard videos. Content which contributes to the perception that every teenager carries a knife and thus drives the urge to carry one themselves, too often with deadly consequences. So what can be done to tackle these issues? The previous government passed the world-leading Online Safety Act. The Act places significant new responsibilities and duties on social media platforms and search services to increase child safety online. Platforms will be required to prevent children from accessing harmful and age-inappropriate content and provide parents and children with clear and accessible ways to report problems online when they do arise. As well as content, the Online Safety Act also applies to service functionality, including the way in which platforms are operated and used by children. And could the Minister confirm whether platforms will be obligated to manage and mitigate addictive functions if a provider's risk assessment identifies habit forming which could cause sufficient harm? So we are cleaning up the online space with world-leading legislation and an enforced regulator. But I worry that is not enough. We should be having a conversation about the use of mobile phones in schools. The previous government took action and issued guidance backing head teachers in restricting access to phones in schools. However, new research has shown that only 11% of schools are genuinely smartphone-free, while children at smartphone-free schools get 1 to 2 grades higher at GCSE. That is why the opposition tabled an amendment to the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill to ban mobile phone use in schools, and it was disappointing that the government rejected that amendment and that argument. I wonder if the Minister could update us as to what conversations they've had with colleagues in the Department of Education about that policy. Conservatives want to put the safety of children first. I hope the Minister agrees with that aim. The More in Common poll showed that nearly 9 in 10 parents, 86%, backed raising the so-called digital age of consent, the point at which children should be allowed onto social media, from 13 to 16. Some members have also proposed banning social media for children under 16. And I note that the Secretary of State has not ruled this out, saying it is on the table and that he is not currently minded to enact the policy. Instead, the government has announced the launch of a study to explore the effects of smartphone and social media use on children. This seeks to build the evidence base for future decisions designed to keep children safe online. The work is being led by a team at the University of Cambridge, which contributes from researchers at other leading universities too. Project lead Dr. Amy Orban has said, there is huge concern about the impact of smartphone use on children's health, but the evidence base remains fairly limited. While the government is under substantial time pressure to make decisions, these will undoubtedly be better if based on improved evidence. We in the opposition agree that the evidence base needs to be improved and welcome this study. The last piece of substantial government-backed research into children and mobile phone use was completed in 2019. That was before COVID. We know the devastating impact of lockdown on children and how pandemic restrictions forced children to connect with their friends and school teachers online. This pushed children towards technology and social media, potentially leading to irreversible changes in behaviour. However, the timeline for this work is unclear. While the research should be detailed and thorough, its publication should also be timely. So will the Minister please outline when this study will report back to back to the Department, and given the dangers of delay, whether he has considered speeding it up? I'm aware that the Children's Commissioner has done some work recently to better understand the impact of mobile phones on children. Her insight could prove very valuable while the academics are researching in depth. I presume the Minister has spoken to the Commissioner, but can he update the House on what he learnt from those discussions? I'd be grateful for the Minister's comments on these points. This poll is a clear illustration of the strength of feeling among parents, but we all know the impact of mobile phones and social media on children, from our own families and from our conversations with parents, teachers and children back in our constituencies. As legislators, we have a responsibility to ensure the online world is a safe place for our children. We also have a responsibility to ensure that online platforms take their obligations seriously. I'm pleased the previous government's Online Safety Act delivers on both those points, and I urge the Minister to ensure it is fully implemented as soon as possible.
Minister, Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you very much. Mr Vickers, it is always a delight to see you, and in particular to see you there where you can't take part in the debate. It's a great... first of all, can I pay enormous tribute to Kim Campbell? I mean, many others have already today, but it is quite a significant achievement to manage to force Parliament to debate something, and to get 130,000 people to sign up to the petition is a phenomenal achievement. So thank you very much. And I think I would say that on behalf of all the political parties in Parliament and all the members of the House. I also like to thank my honourable friend from Folkestone and Hythe, A, because there's a Labour member of Folkestone and Hythe, which is a great advance in the world, and secondly, because he advanced the cause on behalf of the Petition Committee so effectively. One of the changes, many members may not know, but we didn't, when I was first elected back in 1873 under Queen Victoria, we didn't have online petitions. And of course, it's an irony in a way that we're talking about an online petition, an e-petition today, which is about online activity. So I thank him as well. I'm not, if colleagues don't mind, I'm not going to answer each of the individual contributions because I think people have spoken very powerfully for their own arguments, and there's been a bit of a mix of view, but a general direction of travel, which I fully understand, and to which I'm very sympathetic. And I want to lay out kind of where we're at now, and where we as a government hope that we think we could get to, and where we should get to. So the first thing, obviously, to recognise is the utter toxicity of large parts of social media. I mean, you don't have to be an MP to be aware of that, but being an MP does certainly make you aware of that. And the toxicity for children, I think, is utterly degrading and pernicious. I think everybody in society recognises that, and we all recognise too that the social media companies need to go much further to protect children. I mean, we've talked about some of the misogyny that is evident on many platforms and kids have access to, or it's pumped at them, in fact, because that's sometimes what the algorithm seems to support. Similarly, large amounts of utter misinformation, which I don't know who's driving that or why it's being driven. Sometimes it may be state actors from elsewhere in the world, and sometimes it's just pernicious actors in their own right. Completely unrealistic body shapes being promoted to girls and, for that matter, to boys as well. There was a time, I think, when that was solely a concern about how girls were being encouraged to be a particular shape, and but you could apply exactly the same to many young men, young boys today as well. And of course, I used to be a priest in the Church of England many years ago, and I was a clergyman in High Wycombe. And whilst I was the curate there, a young girl took her own life, and then 3 of her friends took their own life in successive months. Now, it was undoubtedly, there was a part of them doing, you know, they had somehow or other managed to engage one another in that sort of spiral. But of course, that was long before social media played a role in this. And now, the pernicious role that social media can play in that undermining of young people's self-confidence, their belief in themselves, through a whole series of different images that are portrayed to them and videos and so on, is very dangerous. And that's why, of course, it's one of the most important things that government has to do, and it's good to have a former Education Secretary here with us today. Oh, yes, of course. He's always intervening on me.
Thank you, Minister, and as ever, you've been very generous in making excellent remarks. I just wanted to ask for his reflection on, away from the emergency, the toxicity, the worst aspects to it, actually it is the mundane sapping of hour after hour after hour that is just as dangerous when considering the social media use and the ineffective guardrails we have of use of smartphone, that yes, we all agree that the descriptions of content that he has offered should be done away with, prevented from. But it is this mundane drip and sap of energy and attention of our young people and that doom-scrolling ethos that we've developed in their expectation of their everyday lives.
Well, I don't want to be a hypocrite because this 63-year-old engages in all of these things as well. And in fact, it's a bit of it's a shocking shame for myself every time I get that sort of notification that says you spent, on average, X number of hours a day on your mobile phone. Now, I can argue justifications because I've got to find out what the seat for the honourable member is and things like that, or I've got to send things back to my private office on WhatsApp, all of those kind of things. But the truth is, I think if somebody had said to us 40 years ago, look, we're going to invent something which is going to make you all, in an addictive way, spend hours and hours and hours looking at a phone rather than engaging with other human beings, we'd have said, yeah, no, maybe not, eh? And I was really struck by this when I went to one of my primary schools in my patch in Blaengarrow, and the head teacher was saying that one of the difficulties was that quite often parents, and somebody else referred to this a bit earlier, I think, parents would come to pick up their kids, and all the parents would be on their mobile phones outside. So the message that every kid got, whatever you did inside the school, the message that every single child will get was, life is all about being on your mobile phone. And actually, whoever it was, I can't remember who it was, somebody over there, I think, but made the point about, actually one of the most important things that a parent can do is engage eye to eye with their children. And if they're engaging eye to eye only with their phone, then that's as much of a problem, I would argue, in this whole field. So I'll come on to some of the issues. I just don't want to be hypocritical about it. I think we all accept that we've got to do more in this sphere. One of the things that wasn't included in the list of things that you might do if you didn't have a mobile phone to spend all your time on is read a book. I mean, I would love more young people to read a book. And these are that kind of longer attention span is one of the things that I think is an admirable part of being an adult human being. Now, several other members referred to the fact that legislation needs to keep up. And if I can put this very, very gently to Conservative members of the House, we were arguing for an Online Safety Act for a very long time before it ended up becoming legislation. And I know it went through a draft process. There were lots of rows about what should be in it and what shouldn't be in it, whether we were impinging on freedom of speech and all those kind of things. But the legislation didn't end up coming onto the statute books until the end of 2023. And then it itself provided for a fairly slow process of implementation thereafter, partly because, of course, Ofcom was going to be taking on powers, which it simply, on that day, would not have had enough staff to be able to engage with. So there has been a difficult process, and I'm absolutely certain that the Online Safety Act will not be the end of this story. And that's why the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology has said quite clearly that everything is on the table, and that's why I think today's debate is so important. Of course, legislation has to be proportionate, it has to be balanced, it has to be based on evidence. I'll come to that in more detail in a moment, and it has to be effective. And that's why the Online Safety Act will require all platforms that are in scope, including social media platforms, to set up robust systems and processes to proactively tackle the most egregious illegal content or activity, preventing users from encountering this in the first place. And platforms will be required to remove all other illegal content as soon as it is flagged to them. The Act will also require platforms, this goes to a point made by several people, require platforms easily accessed by children to deploy measures to protect them from seeing content which is harmful to them. This includes using highly effective age assurance to prevent them from seeing the most harmful types of content, such as that which promotes, encourages or provides instructions for self-harm, suicide or eating disorders. And platforms will also be required to provide age-appropriate access for other types of harmful content, such as bullying, abusive content or content that encourages dangerous stunts or serious violence. Additionally, under the Act, providers which specify a minimum age limit to accessing their site must specify how they enforce these in their terms of service and do so consistently. Ofcom has, as many members will say, we are coming to a key moment in the implementation of the Act this spring. And I think that that's an important point for us to recognise, that things will change later on this year because of the implementation of the Online Safety Act. Ofcom has already set out its draft child safety codes of practice, which are the measures that companies can take to fulfil their duties under the Act, and therefore must. Ofcom's draft codes outline that all in-scope services, including social media sites, will be required to tackle algorithms which amplify harm and feed harmful material to children. I would also argue that that includes the process of trying to make something addictive for a child. Services will have to configure their algorithms to filter out the most harmful types of content from children's feeds and reduce the visibility and prominence of other harmful content. And in January, Ofcom published its guidance for services in implementing highly effective age assurance to meet their duties, including the types of technology capable of being highly effective at correctly determining whether a user is a child. Yes, of course. I'm about to come to his speech, in fact.
I thank the my right honourable friend for giving way. Myself and a number of other colleagues have had fairly extensive dialogue with Ofcom over the last few months about some of these detailed matters. And there are two important gaps in the current legislation. One is that if social media companies put a minimum age requirement in, but there's no power to provide that social media platforms need to have a minimum age requirement to start with. So there is a big gap in the legislation in that respect. And the second is that despite the fairly extensive drafting in the bill, in the Act, there is no requirement on Ofcom to look at functionality beyond where functionality only relates to harmful content. So in Ofcom's view, they have stated very clearly in writing to myself and other members that they cannot regulate functionality unless it is functionality specifically about harmful content. So much of what's been discussed here would not be covered by Ofcom's current powers.
So there's about 4 or 5 different areas where I think the legislation is not sufficient unto the task that we need. And the issue that we have to decide as a government is, with these powers coming into effect now, or this spring, and being implemented in the next few weeks. Both of the codes require parliamentary approval, but that process will happen in the next few weeks. Is it better to make that happen now and bed that in, or is it better to say, right, we're going to have another piece of legislation now? Now, I would be amazed, I'm not allowed to make commitments on behalf of the government, but I would be absolutely amazed if there isn't further legislation in this field in the next few years brought forward by the government. I'd be absolutely amazed. And all of these issues, and there will be others that will come along, will definitely need to be addressed, not least because, as my honourable friend said right at the beginning of the debate, we need to make sure that the legislation is up to date. Now, he also talked in his speech about the burden of proof, and he's quite right. Of course, there shouldn't be a one-way burden of proof. Absolutely right. We do have to bear in mind 2 things, I think, here in relation to proof, or evidence, which I think would be perhaps a better word, because it's not about criminality, it's about evidence-based policy. The first is, as everybody has said and knows, causation is not correlation. Apologies for the slightly flippant way of putting this, but Marathon became Snickers at the same time as Mrs Thatcher gave way to John Major. I am not aware of any causal relationship between these 2 events. Many people understand that, but it's often very difficult to weed out what is causation and what is correlation in a specific set of events. So, for instance, there may be many. We've all laid out the problems in relation to mental health for children. Now, only one member's mentioned COVID. I would argue that COVID is quite a significant player. I think it was quite shocking that we strove hard as a parliament to open pubs again before we opened schools, and that children who bore the heaviest burden and were at least risk bore that burden, that sacrifice on behalf of others. So I think we need to factor that in. Second, I will in just 1 minute, if you'll just let me finish this little bit of my argument. The second is, one of the things I've campaigned on for quite a long time is about acquired brain injury. Children from poorer backgrounds 4 times more likely to suffer a brain injury than kids from under the age of 5, than kids from wealthier backgrounds, and again in their teenage years. Brain injury, acquired brain injury in schools is barely recognised. Some schools respond to it remarkably well, but it's likely that there's somewhere between 1 and 3 children with a brain injury in every single primary class in this land. Nobody has yet really done sufficient work, I would argue, on how much that has contributed to the mental health problems that we have, that children have today. We certainly know that, brain injury does, the use of phones and screens after brain injury is a significant added factor. But that's why we need, I think, we need to look at all the factors that have affected the mental health of children, so as to make sure that we are targeting the specific things that really will work in a combination of policy changes. I said I'd give way.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman who speaks with a great deal, obviously, of knowledge and authority, particularly on acquired brain injury. I wanted to come back to the COVID point there. And there's obviously a debate in Westminster Hall is not the place to establish causation versus correlation versus causality in any sense. But if you look at the graph of what's happened to children and young people's mental health, ill health, I should say, both in this country and in France and in Germany and the United States, they're not perfectly comparable data, but the shape of the line is not consistent with a hypothesis that says it's mainly COVID. It predates COVID and it carries on going up afterwards.
Oh, sorry. If I'd given the indication that I was saying it was mainly COVID, I wasn't trying to say that at all. I'm simply saying that that's one of the other factors that has come to play in since COVID, obviously. And I think there may be many other factors, social factors, personal factors, the structure of education. You could argue, as one of my honourable friends did, around are there any other things that kids can do in society? So some of the interventions that we might want to make would be, for instance, around having a creative education option. We hardly have a youth service in most of the country anymore. Yes, of course.
He makes perfectly adequate points if we were only talking about this country. So all the points you can make about what government policy was, what happened on Shore Start, what happened on youth clubs, what happened on the curriculum, any of those things, they didn't happen in France or Germany or the United States.
Well, I haven't seen any of the statistics about about what's happened to youth service and the cultural education offer in schools in France and in other countries. All I'm saying is a very simple one. Sorry, I can't hear. He wants to give way again.
He takes my point.
Well, no, I don't really. The point I'm trying to make is a very simple one, which is that there are many, many factors that have contributed to the mental health problems that many young people have, and undoubtedly this is one. The question is, how do we rate all of those different factors? How do we address all of those different factors? As the Honourable Lady speaking for the Lib Dem said earlier, one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to address this from a public health angle, and that's an essential aspect. But the question then is, when we have the whole bag of evidence, rather than just individual bits of evidence, what is the most useful intervention that can be made? Now, I want to come on to some of the definition issues. Several people mentioned the issue of what is social media. But obviously, that is an issue that is partially addressed by the Online Safety Act, but we may want to go further. The reason, of course, the previous government landed on 13 rather than 16, which was an option that was available to them, was because the consultation at the time came back with 13. It's interesting, people referred to content availability and that there are two ages in the UK which are generally reckoned as part of the age of majority, 16 and 18. Well, actually, for film classification, it's 12 and 15. Now, there's an argument to say that maybe we ought to be looking at how we look at film classification, because that is a very long established it's a different set of issues in many regards, but some of them are rather similar. So we might want to learn from that, that's from my DCMS angle, to inform the debate that we have in this area. Just about enforcement, several honourable members have referred to the fact that there's no point in just changing the law. If you change the law and you don't have any form of enforcement, it's worse than useless. And that's one of our anxieties at government. We need to make sure that the enforcement process works properly. I take the point that was made earlier that there are two areas in particular where Ofcom feels it's unable to act because the law doesn't allow it to do so, and we will need to look at that. But we need, this is why we are quite keen at the moment to get to this moment in April when the two codes will have been implemented, they'll be voted on in Parliament, and then make sure that Ofcom has not just the powers, but also the ability to enforce. As my honourable friend said earlier, they actually have the power to fine up to £18 million or 10% of qualifying worldwide revenue in the relevant year, which could be a substantial amount, but they need to make sure that they are in a legally effective position to do so. The final point I'd make is this, Mr Vickers, which is that the Secretary of State has made it absolutely clear that nothing is off the table. We are very keen to act in this space. The question is, how do we act most proportionately and effectively in a way that tackles the real problem? Some of that is a question of how the evidence stacks up, and some of that is about when is the right time to legislate. But as I said earlier, I do not doubt for a single instant that this will be the end of the story, that the Online Safety Act will be the end of the story. I would be amazed if there weren't further legislation in this field, in some shape or other, in the next 2 or 3 years. With that, Mr Vickers, and once again thanking Kim Campbell for bringing this debate to us, and sorry, I'm not sure where I'm looking. Over there. Sorry, I've not got my glasses on, so I can't really see very far. And thanking to the member for the Petitions Committee who brought forward the proposals this afternoon.
Tony Vaughan to wind up. I thank the honourable members and the Minister for their valuable contributions and explanation in this debate. As members for Harpenden and Bishop Auckland have said, the status quo cannot continue. I think everyone can agree with that. And I think several members have also said that we need a cross-party approach to dealing with these issues, which I think everyone, again, would agree with. I thank, as many have also thanked, the member for Whitehaven in particular for his analysis on the approach that we should take to the evidence. The anecdotal and correlational evidence of social media is known to us all, especially to parents and teachers, and we've heard much of it in this debate. But putting the onus on social media companies to prove that social media is safe, rather than the regulator to prove it is not, seems common sense. And I'm grateful to hear from the Minister that he agrees with that. Reversing a burden means that the social media companies would have to show that the mountain of correlational and anecdotal evidence of harms that we've all talked about today is explained by something else. But none of the discussion today has really pointed to what that something else is. Of course, as the Minister says, there are other things that are here. There is other material that is part of the picture. But it's not good enough for the social media companies to say, as they currently do, well, it's very, very complicated, and you can't prove that our social media is the problem, so therefore we can get away with doing what we like. And so I am also very heartened to hear it being reiterated today from the Minister that everything remains on the table and that this is a first stage of rolling out what the Online Safety Act seeks to do, but is not the end of action on this. Because whatever the burden, the evidence is evolving and our children are, while we wait, losing out. I'm a big evidence of evidence-based policy making. But we have to take difficult decisions and difficult judgments as legislators on the evidence as it is, imperfect as it may be. And ultimately, of course, a judgment call will be needed. And in my view, the precautionary principle is one that we should give weight to. It's clear that social media is part of the context, even if we can't say it's 51% the cause, or however we want to put it. And so it's really important to say, if it is part of the context, let's take it out. Or let's do something that is more ambitious. But as I say, I accept that the Minister has explained that we need to put the current mechanism into place so at least we can see what we are dealing with. I want to just comment lastly on a contextual point that our colleague made, the member for Southport here, about the importance of keeping foreign actors off our children's screen. That is, of course, an important point. But a big contextual factor here that I just want to sort of acknowledge, without perhaps saying too much about it, but that I am under no illusion about the power of the social media and tech companies. So take the owner of X, who has a role and the US government, to him, the regulatory regimes are relevant to his bottom line. I think somebody else said this as well. And the issues we are talking about, of course, do not only concern us here in Westminster. They may well involve issues of relations with other countries, with how we go about persuading people who we want to help us in different ways to essentially make these very, very bold changes, which may ultimately be needed. And I sort of end on that because it is one of the most difficult aspects of this. And of course, it's not something that one can sort of make it's one of these things that is obviously difficult and is why perhaps it hasn't been talked about too much today. But let's nevertheless not worry about the difficulties, because we are all united in the desire to do something about this. And I think that, for me, is one of the big, important things that come out of today. We're united in trying to sort it out, so let's all work together and do it. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 70086 relating to a minimum age for social media. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is adjourned.
Yeah. Everyone's waiting for us.